Get started. We have a lot of material to cover today. I want to welcome everyone in August of 2022. Here we are again for our annual Summer Institute. Thank you for joining us for our 3-day workshop. This is going to be today from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Also tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday, same time, same bat channel, 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you all for joining us. I'm Donna Riccobono, Project Director of Connections Beyond Sight and Sound. Here we also have our project coordinator, Jennifer Willis. We have our education specialist, Becky Hummer, and our education specialist, Jenny Stepanek. So we're all here today, and we will be monitoring the chat box. So if there's any questions along the way, please feel free to reach out to any of us for any questions you may have or any technical issues or anything else related to our workshop today. So today we are really honored and excited to have Matt Tijian with us. And I've heard, I keep asking Matt, am I saying your name good?
Yes, perfectly.
So we want to also honor everybody else that's here today too. So when your names come up on the screen, it helps us take attendance for certificate of attendance. So if you can just make sure that what comes up for you is your actual name. Sometimes it'll say iPad user 1 or blah, blah, blah. And then we don't know if you've attended the workshop. So if you're looking for ACVREP credits or CPD units through the Maryland State Department of Education, it would be so helpful if we just had your name go across the screen. That would be excellent. So Matt Tijian is an education consultant and teacher of students with visual impairments in Connecticut. I know I wish he was in Maryland, but he's in Connecticut, and he's earned his special education certificate from Southern Connecticut State University. He received a certificate in teaching students with vision impairments from UMass Boston, where he also earned his master's in education. Matt specializes in working with children who have cortical visual impairment. He developed the What's the Complexity framework out of his conviction that children with CVI deserve a visually accessible school day. And we support you too, Matt, with that. Matt is passionate about teaching families and educators about CVI and partnering with them to create CVI-driven educational programs. And amen to that. So we support you with all those efforts, Matt, and we are once again really honored for you to be here. So Matt is going to guide us along the way. There will be some interaction. As you can see, we've already got some polling going on with using our phone. So Matt will guide us through all of that, so no worries. Matt also will guide us through handouts. There was an email that went out this morning that talked about not only the Zoom link for today, and by the way, again, it's the same Zoom link for today, Wednesday and Thursday. So make sure you keep that email handy. And he will also guide which handouts for which day, and he will be using a PowerPoint, and then he will guide us on, he will disseminate the PowerPoint kind of after the interaction and all the good stuff, all the rich information he's going to share with us today. So just be patient and he will guide us through. He is the one with the wisdom today. So again, we have 4 teachers who are certified in Maryland. If you're participating with us for the next 3 days, we have 0.5, which is half credit CPD unit for those that are already certified in Maryland, and ACVREP credits. So I hope you're all okay with us recording. We are discussing within the team how we will disseminate. If you miss a session, either day 1, day 2, or day 3, please feel free to just email and let us know. And we are going to figure out a solution. Either we come together and replay all of the sessions on one day, or we will just send you the link to watch the video on your own. So we're still toying around with that, depending on how many people miss how many sessions. So just bear with us, but we are recording, so you should be able to catch the session at a later time. If you are here and wanting ACVREP credits, the day 1, the opening code is SUN, S-U-N. That's the opening code for today's day 1 session. And we're going to be monitoring the chat box. If you have any questions or concern, feel free to put them in the chat box. Also, if you have a question for Matt, put it in the chat box and we will be happy to read it. And Matt loves to be interrupted and have great interaction. So feel free to go ahead and put your question in the chat box. So we
Definitely.
are here with you if you need anything. And Matt, feel free to talk even a little bit more about yourself. If I missed all the good stuff about, living in Connecticut and anything you want to share with my group, more than happy to do that. So take it away.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, the only thing I would add is that it's really cool to be back. Well, not in Maryland, but with Maryland in this situation, because that's where we were just talking about before people entered from the waiting room that the CBI Phase 3 Boot Camp 2013. That was like my first big in-person learning experience about CVI. It was with Christine Roman Lancy, and it was for like a whole week. And there were students with their families there, and it was so hands-on. It was awesome. And that was, that was just such a formative, experience for me in my career and everything. And so I really appreciate what this group does. And it's really, it feels like really great to be back and to be contributing something to it. So thank you. And thanks for being here today too, everyone. I really appreciate it. And, like Donna was saying, please interrupt anytime with any questions. I really like sort of a back and forth dialogue. So I would definitely welcome that. If you see on the screen here, it says get ready to vote. We're going to be doing some interactive live polling today. And all you need to use is your text message app on your cell phone. And these are just 3 brief instructions on how to get started with it. And even though we're not going to start the polling for maybe another 10 minutes, it'll be good to just enter this information now, just so that it's almost like you're like registered to participate, kind of. So you just go to your text message app, and you enter, instead of a phone number or a contact in that spot, you enter this number, 37607. And then in the body of the text where you would write your message, you write Matt Tejan 422. All lowercase. And I apologize for all the T's in there. I would have made it something much easier, but this is the one it generated for me automatically. But anyway, so you put that in the body of the text. If it doesn't work for you, sometimes people don't have the right amount of T's. You press send, and then you should get an automated message a few seconds later just saying that you're in. So I'll leave this up for just another few seconds, and then I'll move on. And if it doesn't work for you, don't worry. You're not going to miss out. It's just, you'll still be able to see everybody's responses. It's just that, it won't take your response. But also, if it doesn't work for you and you want to respond to one of the questions, just, put it right in the chat, and, we'll see it that way. Okay. Are we okay to move on? I'm going to go. There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to share the agenda for the next 3 days. It's a loose agenda because I always tend to change things depending on how long things take or what the discussion's like and everything. I kind of adjust as we go. But this is day 1, and the first sort of half of today is what I call Imagining CVI. It's going to be a series of exercises and first-person accounts from people with CVI that I like to use to help kind of just enter even deeper, if I can, into the mindset of imagining what it might be like to experience CVI. Even though I can never know for sure for each individual student, the more I think of these testimonies from people, these videos, these kind of almost sort of simulation activities that I'm going to share with you, the more it helps me kind of get in that frame of mind where I feel like I can better imagine what certain situations might be like, or at least imagine what questions I should be asking or what things I should be observing. So that's Imagining CVI. And then the second half of today is really going to be the characteristic difficulty with complexity of object, or what I refer to more broadly too as visual recognition. I kind of use those two terms interchangeably when it comes to 2D image recognition. So I'll be sharing that with you. If you've ever seen me present on that before, some of it will be the same, a lot of it will be new. And I've got some exciting research from Harvard Medical School to share on the 2D image assessment. So that's today. And then day 2, I'm expecting that part of the visual recognition or complexity of object part will carry over into day 2. Specifically, I'm going to do a section on salient features and kind of what I've learned about teaching salient features, a lot of it from Dr. Roman Lancy, mixed with using a lot of her methods with my students and some examples of that that I've come up with. And so I think that'll carry us into the beginning of day 2, most likely. And then in day 2, I want to share a presentation called Coloring Complexity, where I delve as deeply as I can into using color and the power of support that color can be, especially when it comes to academic work for kids with CVI. And then the next section after that will be CVI's impact and complexity as well. Its impact on math, specifically the characteristic of complexity on mathematics, not only accessibility in the moment, but also in overall math concept development. And then what I'm really excited too to share on day 2 is this thing called aphantasia. It's one of those agnosia things that we see sometimes in the more clinical literature. And it has to do with difficulty forming internal visualizations of things, like when you're reading or doing a math problem or trying to picture what your day is going to look like. A lot of us use internal visual imagery, and that can be really impacted, I think, if you have CVI or some related type of brain-based visual impairment. So I'm going to share some of the research on that, and then some of the things that people with CVI are saying about that right now. I think for me at least, it's kind of like an emerging visual trait of people with CVI that many people seem to share. And then on day 3, it's really going to be a hands-on delving into what's the complexity framework. The what's the complexity framework is something that I've developed and used to help me systematically guide teams through the with the goal of implementing an accessible school day for each child with CVI. And it's sort of based on, it's something you would do after the CVI range. It's based on the CVI range. And it's sort of like, okay, now that we know this from the functional vision assessment, how do we guide the team systematically in putting it into place? And it's certainly not the only way to do it, but it's just the way that I've come up with to try to help my teams. And I've found it very helpful. So we'll have like a chance to really use it through a video case study with a student named Paul on day 3, and then after that, imagining one of our own students, either a hypothetical student or one you currently have, and we're going to start doing the what's the complexity framework to complete the early stages and share with each other for one of our students. Okay, so that's it. So day 1 and 2, which I've color coded in purple, it's kind of like, let's explore CVI from maybe slightly different angles, or hopefully. I know that a lot of you will probably have a lot of experience and might already see a lot of things that you already know, but my hope is that I'm presenting it, that some of the ways I present some of the things will be new to somebody. You know what I mean? I'm hoping that everybody will have something they take away from this part that's like, oh, I didn't look at it quite that way, or, oh, I knew that, but this is a way I could help explain it to teams, like that kind of thing. So day 1 and 2 is really like trying to deepen all of our understandings of CVI in the questions we're asking. And then day 3 is more like, okay, if we have this information now, what's one way that we can use to systematically help teams put it into place for students? That was always the hardest part for me. It's like, okay, I thought I gave the team the information, but why isn't it? How do I bridge that gap now between, kind of imparting the information, but then following up and helping them and supporting them and really carrying it out throughout their school day? So I want to start with a video that just came out, which I really like. It's on Perkins CVI Now website. And it's CVI Voices, and it's a 7-minute long video, and it's really the different perspectives of different kids and adults with CVI. So I want to share that because it's going to be a nice segue into this whole concept of imagining CVI. And it was really cool to see this video because one of my students is in there. I recognized a couple others. One of my friends is in there. And then I got to kind of meet other students and hear perspectives I hadn't heard before. Okay, here we go.
Cause of childhood blindness. With CVI, every person's lived experience is different. These are their stories.
Can you state your name?
Chloe Hennessy.
My name is Vincent.
My name is Grace.
Hello, my name is Crusher Stogie Wilson.
Hi, I'm Tina Jushi Cruz.
Hi, my name is Molly Heffelfinger, and I'm here with my son,
Levi.
Hi, I'm May.
Hi,
Hi, my name is Sierra.
Hello, my name is Nai.
I have to the eye.
What I want to bring forth is what it actually feels like day to day. And that includes wanting to collect other CVIers' experiences and bring that forth as well, since everyone has a unique experience.
What do you love?
I like to sing.
Chloe performs in a choir.
I do want to be a singer. I've been thinking about that.
What do you love to do, Aiden?
Play puzzle.
You like to play
Play
puzzles?
game.
You play games?
And dancing.
And dancing.
Emmett laughs on a swing.
I like to sing, play the piano. In the summertime, I like to swim. I like to rock climb and ice skate.
Okay, I like to play video games, and I like to watch YouTube, and I like to learn about history.
I'm currently going to art school at Mass Art or Mass College of Art and Design, and I'm majoring in photography, and photo's my passion.
What do you like to do with Daddy?
Levi holds a pig in a photo on a monitor.
Hold the big fat pig.
Where do you like to go?
Savannah, do you like music? Yes, you do.
Savannah giggles listening to music.
Do you like to ride the trains?
Yeah.
Henry rides on a train. What are some of the challenges with having CVI?
It's hard for me to get around sometimes. Because like people cut me off in stores, especially when they come on the right side because I cannot see anything out of that side, and I'm surprised and I'm like, oh my god. Oh my god, where'd you come from? Like I can't see that.
Print has been very hard my entire life. I've spent 11 and a half years trying to crack the code of print, and it has never worked, and it's always been so hard, and I just, like, it doesn't stick in my brain, and it is just generally very frustrating to work with.
Can you see people's faces? Or is that hard?
That's hard.
Faces are hard, and I usually recognize people by their hairstyles. But if they change their hairstyle or wear a hat, I might not recognize them, even if they are a good friend.
Having CVI feels like being from another country or even another planet, and having to explain the meaning of behaviors and also internal experiences from square one.
What helps?
I have a cane that I use in public.
Chloe crosses a bridge on a chair holding a white cane.
I will need to take a movement break for about 3 or 5 minutes. I have also found that I see things better when I am moving.
What's something that has helped with that part of CVI? Braille. Braille is awesome. It helped me use a different part of my brain to understand print language, and it just generally sticks better in my brain, and I can remember things so much more. And it, like, I'm reading at my grade level, which has never happened before, so it's just awesome.
What do you want the world to know about CVI?
That it's real, and like, if you don't find CVI in like earlier stages, it kind of makes it harder.
I also want people to know that CVI forces us to question everything that we thought we knew about sight and blindness. Most people think of sight or blindness as happening in the eyeballs, but CVI teaches us that apart from that very first step of the light landing on the eyeballs, almost all of the work in sight is happening in the brain. And if you have that eyepiece, that alone is not enough to give you sight. It doesn't give the information meaning. So blindness is not an acuity level. Blindness is not a visual field amount, blindness is a neurological experience as well, which those other things can affect.
I see, but my brain doesn't, and I would like people to know that you can do anything with cortical vision impairment.
You.
Smart and brave.
You're smart and brave. You are smart and brave. And what do you want the world to know about CVI?
Aiden holds up a sign that says, having CVI won't stop me, but I still need your help.
Thanks, Hannah.
Understanding more about my vision is helping me to overcome the difficulties from before, and I feel good that my future is going to be awesome.
It's really important for all CVIers to have a tactile or auditory way to access everything, because it really lets people be included in the same way that visual people are doing with visual methods.
I hope this helped give you some insight into CVI, and I look forward to building a better future for all people with CVI everywhere.
Do you want to say bye?
Logan waves goodbye. The CVI Center, Perkins School for the Blind.
Okay. And then I have one more. So that that video just came out. I haven't shown that to any teams yet, but I see that as something that's going to be really helpful to show to a lot of my educational teams, because a lot of times, you know, when I'm presenting just on that student that they have. And I think sometimes they might think that some of the patterns I'm explaining, you know, maybe I'm kind of extrapolating too much, or it's, you know, maybe this student's doing it for other reasons, or it's behavioral. But I think when they hear from other children, especially who have CVI, I think that's going to hopefully have a powerful impact on the teams too, to say, okay, it's not just Johnny, or it's not just, you know, Sarah, it's all these other kids too that are kind of describing similar things. And then I just want to share a quick, much briefer video. Many of you may have already seen this, but just in case there's a few that haven't, I wanted to share this video by Alfie Fox. It's been on YouTube for a long time, but it's one that I almost always show teams, again, for that same reason, to show that here's a teenager in this case who's, same age as some of my students, who is explaining what his experience is like with CVI. And I think it helps teams take it even more seriously to hear it from another kid.
I walk a lonely road, the only one that I have ever known. Don't know where it goes, but it's home to me, and I walk alone. I walk this empty street on the boulevard of broken dreams, where the city sleeps and I'm the only one, and I walk alone. I walk alone, I walk alone. I walk alone, I walk up. My shadow's only one that walks beside me. My shallow heart's the only thing that's beating. Sometimes I wish someone up there will find me. Till then I walk alone. I'm walking down the line that divides me somewhere in my mind, on the borderline of the edge and where I walk alone. Read between the lines, I'm still alive and I walk alone. I walk alone, I walk alone. I walk alone, I walk up. My I walk this empty street on the boulevard of broken dreams, where the city sleeps and I'm the only one. And I walk up, my shadow's only one that walks beside me. My shallow heart's the only thing that's beating. Sometimes I
Okay. So I like showing that Alfie Fox video because I like, he says, through my eyes, it's a whole different world. Um, and the whole point of this whole imagining CVI exercise to me is like, when we think about people with CVI seeing differently, what might that look like, or what might that be like for each person? And of course, we can never know exactly what it feels like for any individual person. But I think that as their teachers, their family members, their friends, I think it's up to us to try to imagine it. I think if we want to me, I feel like the more I try to imagine what it might be like for each student, or what certain activities or environments might feel like or look like, the better I can do in supporting them. And I like this quote from Gordon Dutton. He says that, "I now like to think of vision as effectively being an ever-changing mental representative construction of the external environment, the nature of which is dictated by the character and processing capacity of the brain. It is the true nature of this mental image that practitioners need to envision for each affected child so that they can inhabit their visual worlds in a manner analogous to virtual reality and see out through the affected child's eyes." So I like that sort of that challenge of, even though we'll never get there for each student 100%, we can at least continue to imagine and wonder and try to, as best we can, to put ourselves in their perspective. And I think, I don't want to use the word simulation usually for what I want to try here today. It's more like imagination. It's more like the series of activities that we're going to try are to help better imagine what it might be like for students with CVI. And in constructing these activities and these analogies, I really am drawing from a bunch of different sources. One of them is just listening to students and families and following their lead. Reading and listening to the descriptions from children and adults who have CVI, who talk about their individual experiences, knowing how the visual brain works and what, as best we can, and knowing what can happen if there's a dysfunction in any certain part of it. And then really just years of observing and evaluating students' functional vision along with the clinical research. I think all of these things kind of come together to influence the way that we might imagine what CVI might be like for somebody. But before I used to just jump right into like simulations and all these videos and things to try to imagine what CVI might look like. But I want to give more caveats because I've given more thought. And I just want to be more careful about how I present it. So everybody take a look at this picture here. There's a grid of nine images, and can you select each one that has a milkshake? Right, this is one of those prove you're not a robot things, right? I think and I almost always, I feel like I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but I almost always feel like I'm on the borderline of failing it. Like I'm always like pleasantly surprised when I succeed. I don't know, the one on the top right might have a milkshake from the sky view. First one on the second row, third one on the second row, and second one on the third row, right? I think that's probably what everybody else got. So we see these things a lot on websites, and they're to test whether or not we're robots or real humans. Well, why would a test like this prove whether we're a human or a robot or, a computer? And the answer is because the human visual system is way more sophisticated still than even the best computer vision programs. And that's because the vision scientists, like those at MIT, who are at the forefront of studying how the vision system works so that they can replicate it in computer vision and in robots, still are very, very far from untangling all the complexities of how the human visual system works. So, we know right now that there's no hacking programs really that can do the same job that the human visual system can and actually identify what these pictures are. So I just find that fascinating. It's a kind of, to me, an example of how of how even the most brilliant scientists in the world are still a ways away from understanding all the nuances of how our visual brain works, and
Matt?
that there's constantly new discoveries. Yeah.
So we're having a little chat about your Zoom bar here in the, it seems like some of it's kind of covering up the words.
Oh, are you guys seeing that? Okay, I can never tell if people
Yeah.
see that or not. What do I, let's see here.
I don't know.
Can I get rid of that? I thought it was just me. Like, I thought you weren't seeing that. Let me see if I go to more. Is there like a hide? I've hidden it before. How did I do that? Let's see.
Anyone feel free to chime in with some suggestions.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was.
Sometimes just clicking on the screen makes it go away.
No, I just tried that. Let's see. We'll figure this out. It's
going across some of your words, which is kind of weird. I wonder why.
Yeah, I'm trying to right click on it here. I'm misreading the thing on the side here.
Anything that says hide.
Hide floating meeting controls. There we go.
Yay!
All right. Thank you, guys. Sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't realize that. Anyway, didn't realize that was showing. But yeah, so hopefully you're not all robots. And I don't know. Is there a milkshake in the upper right? I think there is. But all right. Let's see. All right, so the CVI experience is as diverse and heterogeneous as the brain is complex, right? This is an image from Harvard Medical School from Dr. Maribet and Dr. Bauer and their CVI neuroplasticity research group. And these are meant to represent just the visual pathways in the brain, in this person's brain, this high school student without CVI. And to me, it looks like a whole brain. It looks really complex, but it looks like a whole brain, which just to me reinforces how much of the brain is really involved in visual processing. And I think like, I like to set up all these caveats before we go into like simulations, because I wanted to really stress that I don't want to make it like I'm overgeneralizing any of the people's experiences and stuff by giving some of these kind of exercises that we're going to do. But I think it kind of is a good time to talk about too, like the language I'm going to use, the categories and labels. I think it's helpful. We as humans employ categories and labels to help us understand and to talk about life's complexities, right? Like good and bad. Well, usually a person's never completely good or completely bad, right? We know that. Introvert, extrovert, right? Most people will say, well, I'm mostly introvert or a little extrovert or vice versa, or I'm kind of in between. Usually we have some traits of both. Autism and Asperger's syndrome, where's that line? Cortical, cerebral, visual impairment, I think is another one where it can be helpful categories, but it has its limitations. And same with dorsal ventral. I talk ad nauseum about dorsal and ventral stream to the point where I think my teams are sick of it, maybe, but I still, always keep in mind that this is it's a useful but simplistic way of talking about the incredible amount of interconnectedness of the ventral and dorsal stream and all the different areas of the visual brain. So I think that while labels and categories can be helpful for the sake of conversation in general and helping us conceptualize things, I definitely think they have their limits when they're faced with the complexities of reality. I love this quote from autism researcher Lorna Wing I think she was researching back in the 70s. She said that nature never draws a line without smudging it. And I love that. And I think that applies to, a lot of areas in life, but I think we can apply it to some areas in CVI too. So for instance, the cerebral cortical distinction in some ways, or the ventral dorsal distinction. And here's some kind of CVI quotes that I think relate to that smudged lines concept. So in the Gordon Dutton's book that he wrote with Dr. Zill, they say that injuries to the visual brain that occur in childhood, particularly in the pre or perinatal periods, are diffuse and multifocal rather than localized. As a result, selective visual disorders are expected to a much lesser extent in children, right? So a lot of the examples, or some of the examples that I use are from adults, and we know that with adults, if you have a visual, a brain injury happen later in life, depending on the type of injury, you're often have more of a tendency to develop more isolated, purer forms of isolated visual issues. Like maybe you have just prosopagnosia from a result of a tumor, or just object agnosia, or just alexia, or just simultanagnosia. Whereas with kids, it's often not as easily categorized because it's, the visual impairment is more diffuse. But the good thing about children compared to if you have the injury later as an adult is there's more neuroplasticity, which we know too when we're younger. And here's another quote. So the majority of people, this is from Dr. Maribet, the majority of people with CVI have some combination of cortical and cerebral, or in other words, an impact to both the earlier and later visual pathways, right? I mean, if we think of the CVI range, we're talking about visual fields, which is attributed to the more earlier visual pathways like V1, the primary visual cortex, but we're also talking about like visual recognition, like in complexity of object and things like that. And that's a ventral stream, which is considered a higher level visual pathway. So I feel like trying to limit cortical to the earlier pathways and cerebral to the later path it can maybe be helpful for some discussion, but I think it breaks down when faced with reality. And then also from the Dutton and Zill book, so the dorsal ventral stream model may be too simplistic to explain visual perception as a coherent, integrated outcome of processing and coding. Again, I love it. And, Gordon Dutton uses it a lot. And I think that's the primary way that I talk about the brain and how it processes vision. But again, like, Dr. Maribet will say, Dr. Dutton will say that the streams aren't isolated, they're communicating so much and they're much more integrated than breaking it down by dorsal and ventral would suggest. And then finally from Dutton and Zill, selective visual disorders that can be unequivocally attributed to either ventral or dorsal stream are the exception rather than the rule. So I think it's, to me, when we're thinking about kids, I think that's so true because it tends to be more of a diffuse visual impairment. And that's where I thought, look, I'm going to have to go to a smaller screen for this because I want to manipulate that red line a little bit. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so this is a slide that you might have seen online, and it's from Dr. Maribet's lab. You've got these are the visual pathways in a person's brain, and you've got the control person, a high school student without a visual impairment to the left here. And just to kind of orient everybody, where my pointer is right here, circling, that's the occipital lobe, primary visual cortex, right? And then you've got the, in the back of the head, so the eyeball would be like over here. And then you've got the temporal lobe, the ventral stream. Then you go from the occipital lobe. If you go up, you go to the parietal lobe. You get your motor cortex, frontal lobe. That's the dorsal stream. And you just see all these visual connections. It's so robustly connected. And then if you look at the scan of this person with CVI, who is also a high school student, you see that it's much more underconnected than the control person. And you see, back in the occipital lobe here, you see quite a few connections, but not as robust as the control person. In the ventral stream, you see quite a few connections, but again, not as robustly connected as the control. And then in the dorsal stream is where you see a great deal of less connectivity. And I just took this line because I was thinking if we're trying to sort of like parse out, like this is where the cortical would stop and the cerebral would begin, or this is where the earlier visual impairment would stop and the later level would begin. I can't do it. I mean, right, if I tried to move this line and say, where does this person's visual impairment stop and begin? I mean, here's the occipital lobe, right? But then you've got the ventral stream and dorsal stream over here. It's just really a complete brain-wide, when it comes to the visual brain, a brain-wide phenomenon of underconnectivity. And so anyway, that's where I think, sometimes trying to be too categoristic can not always match up with what I see in my students. Okay. Oh, did this thing show up again? All right, I'm going to go full screen and then I'm going to get rid of this. Hide floating meeting controls. Okay. Okay. So this is a definition of CVI in general. I like this because it includes both what we think of as cortical and cerebral. And it's by Naomi Dale from England, is one of the researchers who coined this definition. CVI is a verifiable visual dysfunction which cannot be attributed to disorders of the anterior visual pathways or any potentially co-occurring ocular impairments. So I like that it sort of says, that it can't be attributed to, they might have an ocular impairment, but even so, their visual dysfunction might not be completely contributed to that, and there may be CVI present. And then also that it just basically includes anything beyond the optic chiasm, any of those posterior visual pathways. right? So to me, that includes the terms cortical visual impairment, neurological visual impairment, cerebral visual impairment, brain-based visual impairment. I don't usually mix the terms up. I always use CVI because I think that's the most common term in the educational field. It has the most literature and strategies that go with it. But what it's helped me with is that if I'm running into a problem, like I'll show you in the math presentation tomorrow, if I'm running into issues where I can tell that students are having certain patterns of difficulty with math or certain types of math, and I'm not sure why, because there's not a ton of research yet on CVI in children, but there's a lot more on adults with brain-based visual impairments. So, I can go look up some of that literature, and it can kind of like lead me into places or paths that I can explore for my kids, even though it might not be exactly the same. I could find much more research on, say, how adults with brain-based visual impairment struggle with certain math concepts. And then when I find out how closely those mirror with the difficulties my students are having, it's like a light bulb goes off, and I kind of know what avenues to explore then. And just to share with you, this is the way I like to share this slide. This is kind of the way that I've, I guess, sort of like integrated or looked at CVI from the perspectives of both the cerebral visual impairment literature and kind of school of thought, and then also the cortical visual impairment school of thought. I've taken so much and learned so much from both. And I don't think there's any one way to either combine them or choose not to combine them. I think there's just so many different valid approaches. And I think a lot of it depends on what student you're working with. But I kind of tend to present from this perspective because it's what helped me kind of combine, seeing more of the overlap between the two. And instead of the differences has helped me support my students better, I feel. So I use this analogy where if we're looking at CVI, like you got these two eyeballs here looking at CVI, and if you're looking at them from two slightly different perspectives, to me it's almost like it comes into 3D relief, and I can manipulate it and turn it around and kind of like examine it better than I could if I wasn't doing that, So that's kind of where I'm coming from, because I want to explain a little bit about the language that I'm using throughout the presentations, and I hope it's not confusing. I try to because I use language from the cortical and cerebral schools of thought, and I try to combine it as thoughtfully as I can. So basically, let's see, I already said that. Okay. So I want to share this really quick too, this word Darren. So this is a picture of a church aisle that's kind of like tilted, right? So it's kind of off balance and tilted. So my brother-in-law, who has CVI, when he was younger, he had a really hard time walking down the aisle in church, and he would need to take somebody's hand and have them kind of support him as he walked through, and nobody could really figure out why, because he had normal visual acuity. But it was after some time, and after he got a little older, he was able to describe that he had trouble walking down the hallway because it looked Darren. It was Darren, and nobody knew what that word meant. It was a word that he made up, because there wasn't a word that he knew in our language to describe how he was perceiving that. So he used this word Darren. Well, come to find out through further conversation, his family found out that he meant it was tilted, and it was crooked, and it didn't look straight to him. So that's something that he doesn't, I don't think, experience as much anymore now that he's older, but it was pretty debilitating in a lot of ways to him when he was younger. But I just like this thought that, like, we have, whatever language I'm using today, it's just sort of a moment, a snapshot in time, and I feel like the more we learn about CVI and the more we hear from different people who have CVI, the more names of things we're going to have to come up with, because there's probably experiences that they're having that we don't have any word to describe yet, like my brother-in-law did. Okay. All right. So before I share anything that even remotely resembles a simulation now, I want to share this quote from Nye D'Amato. They're a person with CVI who writes the blog, The CVI Perspective, which I recommend. It's just really interesting. I really enjoy reading it. And it's, when I started reading it, it was definitely a different perspective for me than on CVI. A lot of things that I hadn't thought of before. But Nye sort of cautions about the extent that you can really take simulations when it comes to CVI. So they say recently a website, and I don't know what website this is. The first time I read it, I thought, oh no, is this something that I put out there? But they say recently a website published an image simulation of CVI vision alongside simulations of other forms of blindness, which you'll see me do in a few minutes in the slideshow. I can't remember the exact image description of it, but I remember someone commenting that it was based off the idea that CVI vision is like seeing through a kaleidoscope. This sparked off a conversation among CVIers that there is no one image that could possibly capture CVI. And that's because when we are dealing with the brain, everything is always complex and multi-layered. When the image simulation was published, several CVIers said that they don't resonate with it at all. It wasn't even an oversimplification, it was way off base. And it's not the fault of people who were trying. It's not because they did it badly, it's because they were trying to do something that's just impossible. It is simply an unfortunate fact of the brain and all neurological disabilities. Accurate simulations and descriptions are anywhere from much harder to impossible to achieve when it comes to the brain and nervous system. So this was really sort of like, a wake-up call for me that, like, no matter how excited I get about a certain kind of like simulation or some sort of exercise that I'm trying, I always want to go into it with this heavy caution that, like, that we're trying to maybe imagine what it might be like for some people with CVI. But we never, I always be careful that I never want to make it seem like I'm assuming that this is what it might be like for, everybody or even a lot of people with CVI. And you'll see I have a sequence of images a little bit like that later in the presentation.
Matt?
Yeah.
Your hiding sliding bar is back.
Oh no, why does it come back? That's so weird. Oh my gosh, it just started pouring here too. This is weird. I'm right outside. I'm right outside on my patio. I've got an umbrella, but all right, I'm gonna yikes. I'm gonna go out of this here. Well, I'm gonna stick it out and stay out here for now. We'll see if okay, where'd it go? Hide floating meeting controls. Huh. All right. So I always, this is something that Dr. Roman Lancy taught me early on, even before the time that we spent in Maryland for that CVI boot camp. She's to me an example of somebody who really, like, I see her inspiration for developing the work that she has as based on just listening to families and what they were saying and listening to students. And so that's like what I'm always hoping I'm doing and trying to do. Because they're the true experts, and I every time I read now a blog by the CVI perspective, I'm just reminded of that. I'm not an expert on CVI, and I never will be, and I think that's just important to, like, always keep in mind, and that the real experts are each individual family and their student, and that no amount of professional experience can replace that or can trump that. If a person with CVI describes an experience that doesn't fit with any of our current labels or understanding, then to me it reflects an inadequacy of our current labels and understanding, not the person. And I think our attempts to imagine and conceptualize CVI always have to be playing catch up to the realities experienced by people with CVI. I love the quote by Barbara Miles. It's from her book, Remarkable Conversations. It's a book on working with students with deaf blindness, one of my favorite books. And she says something like, this is really paraphrasing, I don't have the book in front of me, but she says something like, always wonder. She says something like, even though we'll never know exactly what it's like to experience the world from our students' perspective, if we always maintain a sense of wonder, then we'll be on the right track. We'll be doing the best we can. Okay. So I want to share a little bit about my journey on CVI. It started off with complete ignorance of CVI. And I used the sentence, what's a cortical, to describe that. One of my colleagues, when I first entered the field, was explaining to me how they loved working with students with cortical visual impairment and, how they can help. They've seen their vision improve over time and they've seen all these milestones they've achieved, and it was so rewarding. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, wow, I want to do that too. That sounds amazing. But I thought to myself, what's a cortical? I'm trying to think of the eye diagram that we had in school, and I'm thinking maybe the cortical is like one of those like weird layers of the retinal, the retinal layer cells that I can never remember, and maybe that's where it is, or maybe it's like near the zonules of Zen, that the lens or something. Maybe the cortical's in there. No idea what it was. So I go home after that conversation and I Googled cortical, and it turns out it has to do with the cortex of the brain, right? But that, to me, that represents almost the most complete ignorance of CVI that I had when I was starting. And then on my journey from that to, I don't know, what I would hope to call CVI competence, at least, I guess, which would mean when I go into a school and meet a new student, at least I have a good sense of where I should be starting, to learn about them. That journey really has been a long one and really rewarding. But I think you see the road stretches way past that, because we're never done learning. And I think, on my journey so far, two of my favorite companions have been from both the cortical and cerebral schools of thought, Christine Roman Lancey's work and Vision in the Brain by Dutton and Lueck. And there was this funny moment when I would always, as I drove around from school to school, keep these books in the back seat of my car. They were just part of like what I read all the time, so they were always back there. And one day I looked back while I was driving because my kids were unusually quiet, and I saw that they were both picking up the books and looking through them. So I thought, oh my gosh, what an amazing picture that would make. So when we get home and sitting in the driveway, I said, guys, pick up those books again. And I turned around and took a picture. But I think it described, to me, it just captured perfectly like that I really feel like there's so much to gain from both of these bodies of work. And I've just tried my best to kind of apply it as they're applicable to each student that I have. So, okay, on my journey now, where am I? Where do I think I am now? Well, I feel like that sort of destination marker is a lot closer rather than further along the road, especially as I hear about this experience of adults with CVI. And I feel like, is it CVI competence? I don't really know. I hope so. I hope I'm doing the right thing when I go to schools. But I think the hope is to always learn and to always keep trying to imagine things differently. And I think, if I were to, turn on Google Maps from the point I am now, it might say something like, listen to the experience of people with CVI and their families and continue on for 1,000,000 miles. Because I think, I thought up until this year, I think I thought I was a lot further along that road to CVI competence than I actually am. And through reading a lot of the first person testimonies of teens and adults with CVI, as including some of my own students, I really feel like it's opened up even more. I think it's shown to myself even more of things that I need to learn. Now this thing has popped up again. I'm just gonna hide it. And now it's really pouring out here. So I'm just gonna, I don't know, maybe I'll sneak under the umbrella more. There's like blue sky over to the left and clouds over to the right. All right. Hopefully my computer will hold up. Okay, so that was kind of a lengthy kind of caveat and an introduction. And now let's start trying to imagine CVI a little bit and do some of these exercises. So this is going to be a live poll that we could kind of test our phones and our text apps and see if it's all working. So what color is the dress, right? Some people see blue and black. Some people see white and gold. Some people that I've talked to have seen different combinations that don't fall under either of those two. But I'm gonna, let's see. I'm gonna go to the Poll Everywhere website now, and I'm gonna activate this poll. Okay, so it's gonna be, what color is the dress? Okay, I'm gonna activate it. Oops, I gotta clear it first. Hold on, sorry. Clear responses. Okay, I'm gonna clear it. All right. Okay, so if you see white and gold when you look at that dress, text in the letter A. If you see blue and black, text the letter B. Oh, wow, interesting. So far, so far, a lot of white and gold today. And a little bit of blue and black. It's like kind of moving around a little bit still. All right, so it looks like white and gold is the winner for today, but it looks like about a quarter of you, a little more than a quarter, are seeing blue and black, while the rest are seeing white and gold. I'm seeing blue and black. I can never see the white and gold. So it's just I just find it fascinating, and I'll get to why I'm sharing this in a minute. But I also want to share. Let's also look at this this video. Some of you might. This is sort of an auditory version of the same exercise. So we're going to listen to a video, and they're saying one word over and over and over again. And when you listen to it, most people either hear the word Laurel or the word Yanni. Okay, even though it's the same word repeated over and over again. So I'm kind of curious what the breakdown is going to be for this session, like who hears what. So I'm going to play, oops. My trackpad is like kind of like getting missed on it here. So it's,
Cause of childhood blindness.
That's not what I want.
and also internal experiences.
Wrong video. Okay, let's see here. I'm looking for Laurel and Yanni. Huh, it's not here. You know what I'm going to do then? I'm just going to go to YouTube real quick. Laurel, Yanni. Okay. Why are my friends? Okay, here we go. Okay, so
Carl,
whoops.
why doesn't NJM use mascots? Mascots are silly.
This is why
Saving money
I
isn't.
thought I was
You
trying to
think I'm
save the
silly?
video ahead of time. Work, I guess.
Hey,
Okay,
Matt.
Laurel or yeah.
Jen, also just for future, it might not work for this one, and you've got them. It looks like captions are on there, but just if you could have captions on for maybe some future videos, if they're available,
Oh, sure. Yeah,
to
that's a
save
great
our
idea.
interpreters.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank
Okay.
you.
Sure. All right, so Laurel, Yanni. Here we go.
Laurel,
I'm going to turn the volume up a
Laurel.
little bit.
Laurel, 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 Laurel.
Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm going to go open the poll now. Okay. I'm going to go to Laurel or Yanni. I'm going to activate it. Okay, Laurel or Yanni. So if you hear Yanni, text B. If you hear Laurel, text A. Oh, well, that was a big jump for Yanni. Oh, interesting. This is like very similar to the black and blue, white and gold breakdown. So we've got about 70% for Laurel and about 30% for Yanni. Huh. That's interesting. And I've had it sometimes flipped around. So isn't that interesting? We're all here. The same information is going into our ears, but our brains are interpreting it differently. Our auditory cortex is interpreting it differently. And that's similar with the dress. When we look at the dress, we're all having the same set of data fall on the back of our retina and get sent back to our brain, but our visual cortex is choosing to interpret it differently. I think with the Laurel Yanni, it might be more of an actual inner ear differences, but with the dress, it's certainly a visual brain difference. And they say that with the Laurel Yanni thing, for some reason, younger people, I guess, hearing higher frequencies or something, are more often hearing Yanni, and older people tend to hear Laurel more often, but it's not an exact match. I hear Laurel. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go back to the show here. Okay, so why do I show these? Well, I think it leads really nicely into these David Eagleman quotes. He's a neuroscientist who talks a lot about vision in his work. And he says that despite the feeling that we are directly experiencing the world out there, our reality is ultimately built in the dark, in a foreign language of electrochemical signals. There is no single version of reality. Each brain tells its own truth, right? Just like with the dress, just like with Laurel Yanni. And then he says about vision, seeing is never anything but electrical signals streaming into the darkness of your skull. That's maybe one of my favorite quotes about vision. And I always share this with teams because I feel like if we're going to understand a little bit of what CVI is compared to ocular impairments, then I think we need to re-examine what vision is in the first place. So I like to use this analogy that the eye to the brain is really kind of like a flash drive to a computer. You know, the eye is collecting raw data in the form of light waves from the environment. And it's when those light waves hit the back of the eye at the retina, they're converted to electrical signals and sent back to the brain, right? In the brain somehow is able to build and create visual meaning out of that. So it's kind of like when you take a flash drive that has raw data in it and plug it into a computer, the computer takes that otherwise meaningless data and builds visual meaning out of it, just like our brain does. And for years, I've given that analogy, but only in the past few years have I gotten a greater appreciation of what that raw data from the eyes might look like. You know, what raw material is the brain getting to start with? And this information comes from MIT, the Vision Sciences program. They're doing a study called Project Prakash. And part of one of the things they're learning in that study is more about how the brain learns to see, how it learns to process the data from the eyes. And they give us this wonderful image on the left. They say that when we look at, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back for a sec. This image right here of the girls in the dance recital with the bagpiper in the background, we see this rich, colorful image that we completely understand as soon as we see it, right? But what is the raw data that are, when we look at this picture, what kind of raw data are our eyes really sending to us? Okay, and the folks at MIT are telling us that this is how we can conceive of what that raw data looks like, right? It kind of looks like when your cable's unplugged from your TV and you get that fuzzy black and whiteness, and there's no picture or no meaning, right? What this represents is every little wavelength of light, corner of object, place where there's a shadow, a boundary between shadow and light, place where there's change in color from one wavelength to another. Every little subtle piece of information gets transmitted from the eyes in the form of disconnected individual pieces of data. And amazingly, our visual brain is able to do this with it, right? Our visual brain is able to go back and take all that data, and reconstruct it and decide which of that data belongs with what we call an arm, which of that data belongs with what we call a bagpipe or a leg. And even though the arm and the leg are part of the same entity, a person, the arm is actually closer to the bagpipe than it is to the leg. So our brains are able to figure that out too, that arm and bagpipe aren't connected, right? That bagpipe is a separate object. It's a monumental computing task. And it's just one example of why scientists are still kind of plumbing the depths of our visual system and trying to figure it out. I like these quotes too, which I often share with teams. We don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains. Paul Bach-y-Rita was a famous neuroscientist who studied neuroplasticity, and he was one of the main inventors of the cochlear implant. And then Gordon Dutton talks about 40, sometimes he says 50% of our brain is dedicated to processing vision. Okay, so when we're trying to imagine the way our students might see the world, or the way some of our students might see the world, if we can think of the image on the right being the fully formed end product of a fully functioning visual brain, and if the image on the left is the message that the eyes are sending to the brain before any brain processing happens, then would it be, I don't know, but would it be helpful to think that just from a thought exercise standpoint, that our students' impression of the world is probably going to lie somewhere in between those two extremes, where on one extreme, you've got sort of this jumbled set of data from the eye that hasn't yet been unscrambled and built in the brain. And then on the right, you've got this other extreme of a completely typically functioning visual brain and what it's able to do with that data. Can we think of our students' vision as lying somewhere in between? I think in some ways, I like to think of this almost as, would the picture on the left almost be like a conceptual way to think of phase one, albeit in color, because we know that a lot of times the color processing areas are still intact. The image on the left, could it be thought of more as an early phase one thing where it's like most of this raw data hasn't been unscrambled yet? Whereas the image on the right, is that more closer to that theoretical 10 on the CVI range? And anyway, not that these are at all related, but just sort of like in my own mind as a thought exercise, this is kind of how I conceptualize it. Okay, so here's the thing. So Nye D'Amato is totally right, I think, in the CVI perspective blog that the helpfulness of this kind of exercise right here, I think, is limited. But I do like to show this to teams just to show them, not to show them this is how your student might see, but to show them this is how differently we can think of CVI from ocular visual impairments. So if we think of this picture as like 20/20 acuity, this is a sequence of 3 images I usually show to teams if they're new to CVI. If we think of this sequence of images, if we think of this first one as representing 20/20 acuity, clarity, right? That's the word we might think of. And then if this is 2200 vision, which could represent an ocular visual impairment, it's blurriness, right? So we might think of, ocular visual impairments as being about blurriness as opposed to clarity, right? But with CVI, I think it's much less about clarity to blurriness as it is wholeness to fragmentedness, right? And this is just something I did on my iPhone just to show that, there's lots of pieces of visual information here, and we can't take it for granted that any person with CVI, especially if they can't tell us, we can't take it for granted that their visual brain is taking all that data they're receiving from their eye and putting it together in a logical way that their brain can interpret. So what might that look like? So these are some words that people with CVI themselves have used, right? Several have used the word kaleidoscope. And that's something that Dr. Roman described early on. I think one of her students that she had pretty early on described seeing the world as a kaleidoscope. Visual noise is another one from the literature on adult brain-based visual impairment. One of the adults in a study described the world as being visually noisy. And again, I think a lot of these come back to sort of this concept of visual complexity. Swirl of colors, that's another one from Christine Roman Lancy that she has heard from some of the people she knows with CVI. And then the fun house. This was a quote from one of my students who was a senior in high school a few years ago. And we talked a lot about her CVI, and she actually did a research project on CVI for her senior capstone project. But she told me that for her, she said up close, if something's within 5 feet, I can usually see it pretty well. But she said, as soon as things get, 5 or 10, 20 feet away, it starts to look like a fun house. I can still see it acuity wise, but it's all jumbled and fragmented, like if you walk into a fun house in the fair. Some of you may be familiar with the writing of Dagbert, and I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. I just usually call her Dagbert, but she's from Iceland. And she was at the PCVI conference in Omaha a few years ago. COVID's kind of made me lose track of time, but I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. I guess it was 2018, it says here. But when she was presenting on sort of like trying to show what her CVI looks like sometimes, she showed this picture, and she said, when she was traveling the world and she was in another country to do, I think, a concert, she's an opera singer. She walked into this art museum, and she asked the person who was with her to take a picture of this mural on the wall. And when he asked why, she said, it's because this is the closest, the closest thing I've ever seen, to how I experience novel environments. And to me, this comes back again to this sort of kaleidoscope or visual complexity of, you've got the data coming in from the retina, you've got the edges and corners and colors and all this stuff, but can the brain put it together? She did say that after she gets used to a certain environment and visits it over and over again, it starts to look less and less like this. From one of my students who's now going into 11th grade, which is hard to believe. I started with her when she was in 3rd grade. And when she was in about, I think this was around 5th grade that we did this. We were really starting to focus a lot on self-awareness and CVI and what that meant for her, and talking with her a lot about it, and she started to present to her teachers on it. But she said that when she's in a crowded classroom and there's people walking around and there's lots of stuff on the wall and there's noise, I said, what's that like for you? She said, well, it's like there's a lot of bubbles floating all around me with question marks in them. And so I took that as kind of a really creative way of saying it was total confusion. I said, do you mean like you're confused? And she said, yeah, totally confused. Like, I don't know what I'm looking at. And then I noticed that she had liked to look up at the ceiling and at the lights a lot back then. And I said, why do you suppose it helps? Does it help you to look up at the lights? And she said, yeah, when I look up at the lights, everything's all in a row and there's not much up there. And I said, what happens to the question marks when you look up at the lights or the ceiling? And she said, then the question marks pop and they disappear. The bubbles pop and the question marks disappear. So I just thought that was a fascinating, creative way to put it. I was doing a presentation with that girl and to a new teacher that she had just got in the fall. I think it was the first year of COVID. We were doing it remotely. And I had never shown my student this picture before that I made, but I was showing it to the teacher during my part of the presentation. And when I showed this picture, I heard my student like kind of gasp on the other side of the computer. And I said, hey, do you have anything you want to say about this? Does this, what do you think about this picture? And she said, well, I used to say that crowded, complex environments were like question marks and bubbles floating around my head. And I said, yeah, we talked about that. And she said, well, now after seeing this picture, I want to say that this is more like it. And she said, I want to change my answer now and say that it looks more like when you're playing Minecraft and you zoom in too close and it's way over pixelated. So the next time I saw her in person, we looked up different Minecraft pictures online together, and she chose this one as one that would represent sort of a way she could describe to people and her teachers how the classroom could look to her sometimes when it was too loud, too much going on, too busy. It would become, and a lot of movement, it would become over pixelated. And she said that when I look up at the ceiling, or now sometimes when I look at like a single thing on the wall, like I stare at one single poster for a while or one single thing, the pixels will start to go away. So by sort of staring at one single thing, she was able to tune out some of the other stuff around her. The problem was, though, she said, is that one single thing often wasn't what was being shown on the smartboard. It was often something that was more static on either side of the room. Oops, I'm going to get rid of this floater here again. Let's see. Hide floating controls. So there's another person with CVI named Tina Caruso, and she's an artist, and she's going to school for art in Massachusetts. And she was one of the people in the video that I showed in the beginning. And if you go on the CVI Now website, the link is right down here. There's a really cool thing about Tina and her art. And she talks about how she makes art based on how she sees the world. And she says, I do abstract art because that's how I see the world. She says in her one of her blogs, she says, I don't think I could ever do realistic art because I don't see that way. You know, so this is her interpretation of a bowling alley visually right here. Okay. She says, this is how my brain sees. I can't see depth. As an artist, I will never be able to draw realism, right, because of my visual impairment. I see the world in color. So that emphasis on color. CVI has helped me realize color is a key part of my art making. It helps me visualize what I am drawing or painting. Without color, it's hard for my brain to comprehend what I am seeing and making. And we'll get into a little bit today, but especially tomorrow, a lot more about the importance of color in visual processing. This is another really cool painting by Tina. This is of the student center at her art school, looking in at the student center and down at the student center through this line of windows here. And just interesting to think that this is kind of her perspective when she's looking into a room in the distance. And Tina is primarily a photographer. And so she has one blog post on CVI Now where she has a series of photographs, where she tries to, what she's sort of doing, I think, is like, see how these three are staggered so that they don't line up with each other, and they're sort of fragmented and uneven. She likes to do that, saying that this is sort of one way to also describe how the world looks to me sometimes. Okay, and here's the there's a video now. I'm gonna share this. Let's see, I just gotta get out of the so Tina just came out with a video that's on YouTube, and I think it's on the Perkins website as well. But I just love this video as far as her way of showing how she sees the world as one individual with CVI. And I can't wait to show this one to teams in the fall.
Imagine being blind for a decade. Imagine no one believing you're blind. Imagine you can't process the world around you. Imagine you never will. You wake up every morning and it's like a movie set. Your life is a horror movie and you can't escape. Everything is abstract. Nothing makes sense. Your eyes see, but your brain doesn't. Your eyes see, your brain can't see. Recognize your surroundings. You can't recognize people's faces. You're alone in your world. You feel misunderstood. But you reach for your camera. You record how you see the world. Your camera becomes your eyes. You slowly start to see the world around you. But every photo you take is novel. You get excited, but slowly the photos you take open up the world to you. You get lost in photography. Photography is something you can control. Your camera is your visual system that you don't have. The camera processor isn't broken, like the connections between your eyes and your brain. Photography helps you escape the horror movie. Photography is your way of showing realism. When you draw, you get stuck in abstraction. The horror movie, that is your life. You lose control, you shut down, you go mute, you can't see, you start to cry and scream. The world is too much, the world is too fast. But photography, you can slow down the world. You become relaxed and focused on photography. You become one with the camera. You have control. The camera gives you vision, a dream of how you wish you could see the world. Memories of what you saw that you will never forget. Photography has given you the tool to combat the horror movie. It's the way you connect with the world around you. Welcome to my world. I am the antagonist. The movie set is the world that I cannot access with sight.
I'm going to hide this bar here. All right. Okay, so a little bit. So we know vision is built in the brain, right? I think we all know that. And I'm assuming that probably a lot of us here are already familiar with dorsal ventral stream and occipital cortex, but I never want to totally assume that everybody is. So I just want to go through one slide here to sort of give a quick summary of that. So in this image, you know, this person, the eyeball here is looking at a pencil, right? And you see the light rays from the pencil going to the back of the eye, getting sent from the retina through the visual pathway back to the occipital cortex. If you feel that bump in the back of your head, right, that's where our occipital lobe is. And then, you know, we talk about really the vast networks of visual processing that happen from the occipital lobe onward. We tend to categorize usually into two main groups, dorsal stream and ventral stream. And the dorsal stream is more of that handling the dorsal stream. We think of, I usually think of the characteristics of like complexity of array because it plays a role in visual search, sensory complexity because the dorsal stream is one of the sites of sensory integration, integrating vision with other senses, and then also visual motor. When we think of characteristics like visually guided reach, you know, it's really one of the areas in our brain that's has a lot of responsibility for combining the proprioceptive input of our arms and hands when we reach out, or our feet and legs when we reach out to step, with the visual map of what we're looking at, and trying to combine it in real time so that we can execute a visually guided reach or a visually guided step. And so, and of course, the dorsal stream, when it comes to complexity, it helps us see lots of things at once, and to be able to process it all at once and not just see a couple things at a time. And again, these are like, you know, again, it's more complex than this, but I think this is kind of these categories have helped me just kind of conceptualize it a little bit, when I'm thinking about it. And then the ventral stream is more like our visual library, all right? Dr. Roman Lansky calls it our visual Google search. And I love that image of sort of like when we look at something, our brain sending the information to our temporal lobe, where it then kind of runs like almost like a neural Google search, through all the visual experiences we have until it finds the right salient feature match to really identify what that is that we're looking at, whether it's an object or a face or letters or numbers or a picture. Okay, so those are in a real simple way, or a real quick overview of dorsal ventral stream functions. So when we're imagining CVI, we're going to go through a couple of simulation activities and then break down the experiences into some of these groups of words here. So when it comes to the ventral stream, I'll be talking about complexity of objects, often called object agnosia, in the clinical literature. And then prosopagnosia, or complexity of faces, right? Difficulty recognizing faces. There's going to be content on both of these things. And then for dorsal stream, we're going to be talking about things like optic ataxia or difficulty with visually guided reach, movement processing. That can be either a case where movement is helpful for a student with CVI on a certain level, but then where other types of movement might be difficult to process for even the same student sometimes. And we'll talk about blind sight and achinotopsia. And then simultanagnosia is difficulty seeing simultaneous visual information. And the characteristic on the CVI range that I most closely associate that with is difficulty with complexity of array. And then multisensory processing, so sensory complexity, right? Using your vision and hearing, or your vision and touch at the same time. And then finally, we're going to get to this a little bit in day 2. Aphantasia. I don't know how many of you have heard of aphantasia. It's a new word for me as of a couple weeks ago, but it describes a phenomenon that I've seen with my students for a long time, and one that more recently adults and teens with CVI have been describing as part of their experience with CVI. And basically what it is it's an impairment in the ability to visualize, to create internal movies in your mind, like in your mind's eye, like when you're reading a book or when you're trying to solve a math word problem and things like that. So we're going to get into a little bit of the research that I found on aphantasia and explore a little bit how it might be related to some of our students' experiences with things like math and reading comprehension. Okay, so while we, of course, cannot know exactly how our children with CVI experience the world, we can do our best to imagine that experience. And so this is the first exercise, and feel free to either get these handouts or not. You don't really need them. You can use them if you want. There were really only, I think, 2 handouts for today in the day 1 folder, and this is one of them. It's called My Daily Activities. And again, this is just, you could just follow along with me if you want, but I know some people might like to just sort of have something to go by and do their own. But if we look at this grid here, or this table, and we think about 4 or 5 tasks that we did so far today, I often put morning tasks down there, like brushing teeth, getting dressed, making breakfast, eating breakfast, traveling to work, things like that. Let's think about everyday activities like this that we might take for granted. And now let's consider the visual demands that these tasks pose to us. Are the visual demands, for example, of brushing your teeth, comfortable, meaning that they're well within your visual abilities and you can do it without thinking about it? Are they challenging, meaning that you can do them visually, but it's a real challenge and it's a stretch, and you kind of have to really consciously think about the visual demand as you're doing this task, right? So for me, a Where's Waldo picture would be like a challenging level visual task. I can almost always find Waldo, but all of my conscious energy goes into the visual part of that task, and I'm not thinking of anything else. Or is it frustrational, right? So frustrational would be a visual task that's just plain beyond your visual abilities. And that might be something like Dr. Roman has used in the past, like she talks about the Pittsburgh Pirates Stadium, right? I think it used to be called Three Rivers Stadium. Imagine standing on the field and looking into that stadium and trying to find your mom, right? I mean, that's something that's usually beyond our visual abilities, all right? So it would be frustrational visually. So go ahead and think. You could either fill out your own version of this sheet, or just kind of think of a couple tasks that you did today already, and think about the visual demands of those tasks and whether they were comfortable, challenging, or frustrational for you. So let's take a minute to think about that, and then I'm going to go to the live polling, and we can kind of see each other's results. Okay. Well, it looks like every time I press escape to get out of full screen mode, this thing pops up. All right, let me try it again. That's why it keeps popping up. Okay.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
It's almost 3:30.
Okay.
So just to give you a time
yes,
where we are.
Thank you very much. How about after this quick exercise here, we can take a break and then come back?
Perfect.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for reminding me. Can't believe how fast the time goes by. All right, let's see. So I'm going to go to this poll here. Okay. Let's see, and activate. So think about those tasks, tasks that you did today and the visual components. Were the visual components for most of the tasks comfortable for you, challenging, or frustrational? If they were comfortable, text in C, challenging B, or frustrational A. So far, 100% for comfortable, a little bit for challenging, and none for frustrational. Okay, so about 85% comfortable, about 10% challenging, and about 5% frustrational. Interesting that there's some frustrational. I wonder, I'd be curious, it's always interesting to hear, I always like to hear sort of like, because of course we all have, even people without visual impairments have our own visual thresholds, right, for complexity. If you don't mind, somebody who put frustrational or even challenging, maybe to just speak up and say, or even write in the chat, what the frustrational or challenging task was. Trying to think of tasks that would be frustrational to me visually. I think it's things like I guess, yeah, well, for me, it would be sometimes trying to find my car in a parking garage. If I didn't look exactly where it was and take a picture of it, and I'm looking at this giant array of cars and I can't find mine. And there's a bunch of other cars the same color, and so I can't quite pick out the salient features of my car versus the other ones. So that would be an example, I think, of a frustrational visual task for me. All right, very interesting. Well, why don't we at this point, I'm thinking maybe like just a 5-minute break if that's okay. But of course, feel free to come and go anytime during the presentation if you need to take a break. But I'll pause for like 5 minutes now just so people can, if you want, go take a break or send an email or do whatever and not worry about missing anything. And we'll come back at 3:35.
Sounds perfect, Matt.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Matt, did it stop raining where you are?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that. I'm looking around. The birds are chirping now. The sun is out. I'm all wet though. It's so funny. My whole back of my shirt is wet. Like I'm at this I'm at this this table, this picnic table out here with a big umbrella over it, but like it was pouring off the umbrella down my back. But it's kind of nice because it's hot out now, so I'm kind of feeling cool. So it's good. But I was worried my computer was gonna if my computer started to get more wet, I was like, oh no, it's gonna get all short circuited or something.
Wow.
But, yeah, it was strange. Now it's like a perfect sunny day. But
Okay. Well, I'm glad you
all
could
right.
get wet.
Yes, me too. Well, and I was like, well, I
Matt,
could
is
yeah.
it possible? Is it possible to put up the white and gold dress real quick?
You mean the blue and black dress?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant.
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's see here. Yeah, you know, it's funny though, because like even though I knew what you meant for a minute, I'm like, wait a minute, that's blue and black. You know, it's like it's so hard to unsee what we see, I guess, you know. Here it is. What are you thinking about it? Can you see white? Are you trying to see if you could see the other colors?
Yes, and it's very difficult for me to see the other colors.
I could never see the other white and gold. I'm looking at it right now too, and it's like vivid. It's like it's almost like a royal blue. I mean, it's really, really blue. The blue part, and the black part is pretty black. I can see where some people say it's like a really dark brown, but it looks black to me.
And what is the thought process behind that again?
All right. Well, yeah. So the most convincing scientific article that I read about it was that it has to do with our brain's need for color constancy. In that basically, whenever we look at something, let's take an apple for example. When let's take a red apple. We usually see this apples as red, right? Like unless they're Granny Smiths. But so if we're looking at a red apple inside our kitchen, and there's overhead soft lighting, then the array of light waves that are coming into our eye from that apple are going to include the red from the apple, but they're mixed in with the light source. They're influenced by the type of lighting that's shining down on it, that's reflecting off of it. So the overall totality, like the sum of the light wavelengths coming from that apple, is going to look a lot different than when we're out on our patio looking at the same apple. When we're looking at it in the sunlight, we're going to get a completely different set of wavelengths of light coming in. And our brain has to calculate that and figure out that, okay, I know that I'm outside right now and the main source of light is sunlight. And this is the array of light I'm receiving. When I go in and look at the same thing, I'm going to receive a different type of light. It has to subtract and calculate all of that out so that it still sees it as red, regardless of which light source it's under. And so usually our brains all agree on what the light source is, right? Like if we're all outside looking at the apple, where our brains are all going to agree that the sun is the source of light, therefore the apple's red to all of us. But in this picture, just by a fluke, this was a total accident. There appears to be, it tricks the brain into thinking there's two different sources of light. Like some people's brains choose one source of light, maybe the light coming in from the window. In other people's brains choose maybe the fluorescent light of the store or something like that was the explanation. So that some people's brains interpret that wavelength, that set of wavelengths as black and blue, and other people's brains interpret that same set of wavelengths as white and gold, because it's doing a different calculation based on which light source is in play.
When I see pictures of heirloom tomatoes and they have all the different colors, there's purple ones, there's black ones, there's, and whether you see it inside or whether you see it outside, it all looks the same. So, I like to see if you can transition between looking at, see it one way and perceive it another way as well. But my brain is just stuck. And I just, I see those heirloom tomatoes all the time. The colors are the same, whether they're inside, whether they're outside.
Right.
But, when I
totally
see a dress like this, I can't seem to shift to a different color.
Yeah, because it's in the picture. So when you look at this picture, regardless of where you are, you're going to choose your brain is going to choose a source of light from inside the image. You know what I mean? Like, so in this image, there's like different sources of light falling on that dress. And so your brain's trying to figure out which source of light in the image is the correct source of light. If you were to take this dress, the real dress, which is actually black and blue, the real dress is actually black and blue. If you took it and you were out on your patio holding it up and looking at it, it would look blue and black. Then if you took it into your kitchen, it would also look blue and black, because your brain's not confused by the lighting sources and it's doing all the subtraction. It's just that for some reason, the way the light was at play inside of this picture, the way it was playing off the dress, is confusing our brains into like taking sides and thinking that some brains think it's under one source of light, some think it's under another. So in other words, if you were to, so it's like it plays with that whole formula where your brain's trying to like keep that color constancy. But that's the best I can do.
Okay,
I think
thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. All right, let's see. So I'm gonna, well, welcome back, everybody. I'm gonna hide this silly thing again. Oh, you know what? There's a key command. It keeps showing me what the key command is. I should just do that. I'll do that next time. Okay. Keyboard shortcut. Okay. So just to show that all of my tasks this morning were visually comfortable too. And so this is just another way of showing that. And I show it in this version just because it's a sort of an example of when we get to the actual what's the complexity system or framework in day 3, we're going to be doing something that looks similar to this for our own students. So why is it though that most of us can go through our day and the vast majority of tasks are at our comfortable level visually? Is it because the non-visually impaired brain is limitless in its ability to handle visual complexity, and there's really no bounds to what or no ceiling to what our brain can handle visually? I don't think that's the case, right? We all know we have a threshold for the complexity that our own brains can handle. I think Gordon Dutton puts it really well. I think he's got the answer here. He says, society chooses to present information in a way that the majority of people can see clearly, ensuring that it falls within these normal limitations. But those with reduced vision are not always able to see within these limits, and the information is not accessible. In other words, the reason why most of us go through a visual world in which almost all of the visual tasks fall comfortably within our visual abilities is because we've designed them that way. We've designed so many aspects of our visual world to fall comfortably within the visual limitations of the average human visual system, right? So, but a kid with CVI, in contrast, spends a day in a visual world that was designed for someone else. And we're going to spend a little more time tomorrow really looking at what some of the ways are that we use color and different strategies to design our visual world, and how we can do the same thing for some kids with CVI, just at different thresholds. Okay, so here's one of the main simulations that I want to show you. And I almost shouldn't even put the word simulation, because I feel, it's really more of a thought exercise. But I'm not attempting to simulate here what CVI might look like. This is about a 5-minute exercise. The point is to sort of simulate what CVI might feel like, what it might feel like to go through a day where most of the visual tasks were either at our challenging or frustrational levels, right? We're only going to spend 5 or 7 minutes doing that now, but try to take this experience and then imagine doing that for a whole day. Okay, so here we go. So I'm gonna get out of the presentation again here and go to the video. And basically the video, when you watch the video, definitely have your sound up too, because there's a real important auditory component to this. And you're gonna see 5 different tasks written out on the screen, and try your best to complete each task and keep trying and don't give up until the task changes to the next task, okay? And then start the next task. And when we're done with this, we're gonna do a poll and we're gonna talk about it a little bit. Okay, so here it is. We're trying to simulate what it might feel like to have challenging and frustrational level visual tasks.
Pretty much strawberry. I'm in school right now, and I'm in the cafeteria. I'm making a video with my friend, Scarlett. Her real name is anonymous, and she wants to be told, yes, like my flower.
Okay, hey, what's up, and it's me, Blue Zipper again. And I hope you like this video. And I gotta find Gumball. Give me a second. Hey, everybody. We got a new student. Ready?
So I call these the big three, right? Visual, like the complexity of array in the background here, the movement, and the noise. And to me, those are like the three of the biggest things that can make it difficult for a person with CVI to do any task in that environment.
Pretty much strawberry. Mm-hmm. Hi, strawberry. I'm in school right now. And I'm in the cafeteria. I'm making a video with my friend. Scarlett. Whose real name is anonymous. And just wanted to be told, yes, like my flower. And my flower. Alright. Okay, hey, what's up, and it's me, Blue Zipper again. And I hope you like this video. And I gotta find Gumball. Give me a second. Hey, everybody. We got a new student. Pretty much strawberry. Hi, strawberry. I'm making a video with my friend. Scarlett. Pretty much strawberry. Hey, everybody. We got a new student. Pretty much strawberry. I'm in school right now. And I'm in the cafeteria. I'm making a video with my friend. Scarlett. I'm in school right now. And I'm in the cafeteria. And I'm making a video with my friend. Yes, like my flower. Scarlett. Whose real name is anonymous. And just wanted to be told, yes, like my flower. And it's me, Blue Zipper again. And I hope you like this video. Okay, hey, I gotta find Gumball. It's me, Blue Zipper again. And I hope you like this video. We got a new find Gumball. Pretty much strawberry. Hey, everybody. We got a new student. Pretty much strawberry. Okay, yes, like my find Gumball. Pretty much strawberry. Hey, everybody. We got a new student. Pretty much strawberry. I'm in school right now. And I'm in the cafeteria. I'm making a video with my friend. Scarlett. I'm in school right now. And I'm in the cafeteria. And I'm making a video with my friend. Yes, like my flower. And whose real name is anonymous. And just wanted to be told, okay, like my flower. And it's me, Blue Zipper again. And I hope you like this video. Hey, I gotta find Gumball. It's me, Blue Zipper again. And I hope you like this video. We got a new find Gumball. Pretty much strawberry. Hey, making a video with my friend. Yes, like my flower.
And don't try to multiply these. Sometimes people try that. So I put that triangle at the bottom. Try to count, not using your fingers, but try to just count with your eyes and see how many rows down you can get.
Pretty much strawberry.
All right, I'm assuming everyone had a chance to find Waldo. Let's see. So, all right, now the all right, and the poll is going to be, oh yeah, we're going to do this poll. Let's see. Did anyone give up? Okay, so let me see. I'm going to go to the I should have just done that instead of should have gone straight there. All right, let's go to the polls, and I'm curious to know if anyone gave up. Here we go. So, so if you stuck with it and completed all tasks, which I'm sure most of you did, text B, and if you gave up on at least some tasks, text A. Oh no. Okay, all right, we got some motivated hard workers here. All right, 10. Ooh, boy, it's shrinking though. 10%. Oh, okay, here we go. It looks like it. So it looks like the majority of you gave up, and a few people hung in there and really stuck with it. Okay. Okay, we'll address that in a minute. But first, I want to ask you one more question. Okay, this is kind of cool. This is going to be a word cloud. Okay, so for this one, all you need to do is text in one word to describe how did it feel to do challenging and frustrational level visual tasks. One word that kind of describes what the feeling was like. Just text it in, then we'll get to kind of see everybody's up there in a word cloud. Nope. That must have been from one of the people that gave up. Exhausted, overwhelming, hurts, defeated, defeating, yeah, stressful, uneasy, irritable, and overwhelming and overwhelmed are the two biggest ones so far, meaning that multiple people said, texted those words in. So far, overwhelming is winning. Confused, exhausted, just stupid. Either you felt stupid or you felt this is a stupid task. It's definitely a stupid task, but for a purpose. All right, impossible. All right, so this is great. Well, thank you. All right, let's go back. Let's talk. I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit now. All right. Okay. All right. So we know most of you gave up, and so what I did, I thought that might happen. So while you guys took a break, I went ahead and composed a kind of a boilerplate language email that I got to send to your employers. And I'll just share it with you just so you're not blindsided by it. But it's Dear Employer of What's the Complexity Workshop Participant. I am concerned about, I'll insert your name here. They were non-compliant during my session today, refusing to complete a test I had given. As a result of their off-task behavior, they did not earn their certificate of completion for the workshop today. I know they can see just fine because during, well, I'm going to change this for online, but during registration this morning, they located a very tiny cracker they had dropped on the floor and were able to pick it up. I don't think their behavior today was a visual issue. It must just be behavioral. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Have a good day, Matt. So, this will be, probably have to talk about this, but no. So anyway, how many people have seen, an email like that, maybe to one of their students' families, or if you're a family of a student with CVI, maybe you've seen an email like this. I hope you haven't. I think probably in the past, before I knew better, I probably misinterpreted some of my students' visual difficulties as behavioral as well. But I always show some variation of this email to most teams to kind of, at the beginning of the year training, to kind of drive that home that, this is a common thing I think that families of CVI, kids with CVI have to deal with, and let's try to avoid doing that. So we just spent
No, I can't do that now. I'm in my
you gotta, somebody's got to mute. But so we just spent 7 minutes doing challenging and frustrational level tasks. Imagine what that would feel like for an entire day. So Nye D'Amato from the CVI perspective says that trying to use our eyesight had always been exhausting, confusing, frightening, and straight up traumatic. When you have CVI, seeing is not passive. Anything sight related is active work, relentless, grueling work, tons of effort, very little payoff. It is always a big deal. And then I think we'll talk a little bit about behavior. So how that can lead to behavioral issues, just like described in that email. CVI Scotland describes what they call CVI meltdowns, and they define it as an incapacitating behavioral reaction to too many sights and sounds in children with CVI, has commonly been described by parents who have contacted us. We have called this a CVI meltdown, as this description is easily recognizable by parents and carers. And they talk about some of the triggers, noise, visual clutter, busy environment with lots of movement, unfamiliar environment. So I see a lot of these, again, when thinking of the different sort of schools of thought in CVI, there's so much overlap. I mean, so many of these words right here directly relate to some of the CVI range characteristics, So I think that's important. It's been important to me in seeing so much of the commonality of experiences across, whether we're in Europe or America or different schools of thoughts. I think there's so much in common when it comes to the things that we need to be looking for. And then CVI meltdown emotional reactions. So they talk about things like totally overwhelming fear, causing a very real perceived threat of physical injury, emotional stress, tiredness, brain fatigue. And I like the word brain fatigue because, you'll see in What's the Complexity, I talk a lot about visual fatigue. When we're talking about visual fatigue for people with CVI, I think it's helpful for teams to understand that it's really probably less about eye fatigue and more about brain fatigue, right? And being a lot more than just strained eyes. What are some CVI meltdown behavioral outcomes? Could be headaches, screaming, lying on the floor, unable to stand or walk, physically attacking, escaping. And these are this isn't from a scientific study. This is just from anecdotes and stories of people that have written in, families that have written in. And I think it's important to note too that these are all outwardly observable potential outcomes from a CVI meltdown or from being overwhelmed from the visual environment. But I think for every observable reaction that we see or observable experience, there's probably way more than that in internal experiences that our students are going through that we might not even see a behavioral outcome for. So when our students are facing a lot of complexity and their materials and environments aren't redesigned or modified or accommodated for their CVI, then we often do see what some people might call inappropriate behavior. But I put that in quotation marks because I don't think it's really fair for us as the adults to call a child's behavior inappropriate when we as the educators may not have designed an appropriate activity for them in the first place. And their response to that inappropriate activity might actually be reasonable if we understood why the activity was inappropriate for them. This is from Chapter 7 of Vision in the Brain. The child may be overwhelmed by the people, sights, and sounds in a crowded environment, and the resulting stress may lead to withdrawal, an angry outburst, or anxiety. The child may be labeled as non-compliant or oppositional when they avoid or refuse to do a task, when in fact they may have become visually fatigued and need better scheduling of activities and regular rest periods to optimize functioning rather than a behavioral reinforcement plan. And so behavior is anything a dead person doesn't do. Right, this is what when I was going to school to be a special education teacher, one of my professors was a behaviorist, and this is how he defined behavior. And he taught us that there's no such thing as just behavioral. Everything that a person does is a behavior, right? And so everything that a person does has a function or a reason behind it. It's not just for the heck of it. So that's been helpful way for me to look at the outwardly observable behaviors of my students with CVI. And I can use this sort of humor and language when working with a BCBA. And when we go through a child's day together and try to brainstorm about why a child might be acting a certain way, I would like to make sure, I think of my part as being to make sure that the behaviorist thoroughly understands the reasons why visual aspects of the environment and materials and the school day might be contributing to the behavior we're observing. All right, going through the different aspects of that simulation we did a few minutes ago, each activity was meant to represent a certain CVI characteristic, or to kind of see what it would be like to reach our own thresholds in those characteristics. So the first one is visual recognition, or difficulty with complexity of object, or if you're reading the cerebral literature, visual agnosia, right? Difficulty recognizing what you're looking at. All right, and that's largely a ventral stream task. All right, so what is this, right? Did anybody get it? Some people have guessed turtle shell. It's not a turtle shell. I deliberately picked something really kind of off the beaten path because I didn't want anyone to get it, and I was hoping that it would look real enough, like it's in nature, it's a turtle shell, or it's something, or a snail, or something like that, so people would think they're supposed to know what it is, but can't quite put your finger on what it is. This is actually a fossil. It's part of a trilobite fossil. And again, I picked it because I knew nobody would probably get it, but also that it kind of looks like some kind of insect or shell or turtle or some kind of animal that you think you might be supposed to know. At least that's been my experience so far. And so I think, this task required us to demonstrate a cognitive skill, which was rhyming, but it was based on an image that we couldn't interpret. So no matter how long we stared at the screen, no matter how big the image was, no matter how clear it was or high contrast, we were never going to get the task because we couldn't interpret the image. There was no match for it in our ventral stream's visual Google search, as Dr. Roman would say. Okay. This is something that I've seen a lot of people use in there, and I think it's a good one to use with teams. But it's try to see if you could see what's in this picture. Some of you might have already seen it. Ellen Mazel's presented a lot on this one in the past. That's where I got it from. And I've seen others present on it too. But I like to use it with teams because it's another way to explain why I use so much color with some of my students with CVI. All right, so maybe you've gotten what it is from past experience. It's not visually novel anymore. But if it's the first time you're seeing this and it's novel, then my guess is that the complexity is sort of too much to figure out what it is. But if I take the color yellow here, or no, I'm sorry, purple, and outline some of the salient features, then you can see it's a cow, right? I've taken this otherwise confusing visual data, and I've showed the brain a way that it can be grouped to form something that's familiar. Okay, see if you can take a look. I'm not going to keep going to the poll for these next two just because I want to, just for the sake of time a little bit, but see if you can name and just maybe mention in the chat, if you can pick out anything in this image and name what it is, please just write it in the chat, and maybe Donna can read it out loud to me. Anything coming through?
So far we have possibly a bird, maybe some paper, maybe someone's arm.
Possibly a bird. Interesting. I don't know. Yeah, I like all the. I really appreciate all you who are being brave and attempting this. And I like how you're using language like possibly and maybe, because like that's I think reflects the uncertainty, right? And I like this simulation for difficulty with complexity of object or visual recognition difficulties, because your acuity is okay here. I mean, the picture is a little blurry because I blew it up, but for the most part, it's not a clarity issue. It's more, you can see it, you can see the colors, the edges, you can see the different features, but they don't seem to go together in any sort of coherent way that you're finding a match for in your ventral stream, right? I can't. Sometimes people with CVI have described seeing stuff rather than things. Because of that difficulty with visual recognition, I can see a pile of stuff, or even if it's one thing, it's stuff. It's not a thing because I don't know what that thing is. I can't find that match. Here's a similar picture. I like this one because it's clearer. It's not as blurry as the other one. And just similar. Take a couple seconds. Can anybody find anything that they recognize here?
Could be a room with shelves or books, more
Mhm.
stuff.
Could be. I like that too. Again, it could be. Nobody's come right
Sure.
out yet and said,
There's a lamp, windows.
oh yeah, I do. I think that those could be windows. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe a lamp. It does look like a lampshade, but it's like on top of something too, right? It's kind of weird. It's like on top of that shelf or something. It doesn't, I don't know. Or is it a bell with a handle on it? Like a white bell with a wooden handle sticking up. It would be too big to be a bell though. Right? See, it's weird. And I think, I don't know, one time, I'll just go back to the other picture for a sec. See this like black thing right here? One time someone said like, it's definitely a teddy bear. It's a teddy bear. And I think they were thinking because it's black and it's got like this, maybe it's a nose here or something. But then I said, do you think it's a teddy bear or are you certain it's a teddy bear? And they said, I'm certain. And I said, would you bet me $50 that it's a teddy bear? And they said, I'm not certain enough to bet $50 on it. So just interesting that like, you know, we're pretty visually certain on what we're seeing, right? But what would it be like to look at a room full of things and maybe not recognize one thing in it, or maybe recognize one or two things, but not be quite sure? To me, that's maybe thinking about what it might be like to have that difficulty with object complexity, difficulty with visual recognition. Okay, Control Alt Shift H. There we go. All right. Okay, so we just encountered the limits of our ventral stream's ability to identify what we are seeing. So we all have our threshold, right? These pictures just exceeded our thresholds for being able to identify features on objects. But what might do that? What might be that threshold for a kid with CVI, right? It could be all different things depending on where they are in their CVI, right? Where they are in the range, what kind of characteristics they have. But you know, for some kids, it could be that threshold might be looking at a multicolor object, right? For another kid, it might be looking at a face. For another kid, it might be looking at a black and white line drawing or a picture in a picture book, like a cartoony type picture. Looking at a worksheet with like drawings that they maybe can't interpret on it. And so we have to kind of scour the internet for weird things to reach our threshold for like what we can't recognize, right? Like these pictures that I showed you. But I feel like for our kids with CVI, they're constantly presented. Imagine if like every day, you know, you're sitting at your desk and all your peers and you get a worksheet that's like saying, okay, you know, name everything on this worksheet, right? I mean, imagine if that was your experience every day and your peers were magically getting it all. It was easy for them. They were handing it in. They were talking on the side while they waited for you to finish. And like, you couldn't get any of it, you know? I mean, I wonder if that's what this worksheet on the right might be like day after day after day for some of our students. Okay, what about prosopagnosia? The Perkins assessment that's coming out on their website, they call it access to people. In the CVI range, it's difficulty with complexity of faces. Okay, so I love this. This is just a few slides on faces, but I love this analogy. Another, again, reason why I like to sort of explore all the different schools of thoughts and kind of compare and contrast is that I find little things like this that help me understand the experiences more than I would have otherwise. So there's a book about childhood prosopagnosia. And it's really, I mean, if you read it, it's just like it's written about any kid with CVI, just about, you know, it doesn't seem like something different from me. It seems very, very relevant to my students. And it's written from the standpoint of adults with prosopagnosia who have had it since childhood. And they talk about what it was like being in school and what it's like now, having difficulty recognizing people or emotions on people's faces. If I wasn't thinking of that word prosopagnosia, I probably wouldn't have ever stumbled upon this, but I think it's a real gem. And they've given me a lot of insight into how some of my students might be experiencing faces. So what is it like to have difficulty with complexity of faces? Well, Jim Cook is one of the contributors to this book, and he has prosopagnosia, and he says, let's use this analogy. Try reading this sentence, and it's the one that I wrote in pink here. Try reading that. My guess is you can read every word, but there's not really a coherent meaning to the sentence. And Jim Cook writes, you know what each word means, but what does the entire sentence mean? But he says when you put some punctuation in it, then it has perfect meaning, right? So now read that sentence in pink. Same words in the same order, but you put that punctuation in, and it sort of gives us a gives our brain some rules on how we're supposed to order and chunk and group those words, and then the sentence makes sense. And Jim Cook says, without punctuation, it's just a bunch of words. I look at a face and I see the face, I see the eyes, but it's just a bunch of features. It means nothing. So it's almost as though the punctuation is missing when I look at a face. And I stress to teams, this is one person's experience and way of explaining it, but this really, I found, has hit home with a lot of teams and really helped them take their students' difficulty with faces more seriously, because it's like I explained it in a way using Jim Cook's words that they were able to really latch onto it and understand it. So we recognize faces primarily in our ventral stream, right? There's a visual face recognition area in our temporal lobe, and let's exercise that area for a minute. Let's play with that area in our ventral stream for a second. So let's take a look at these faces and see how many of them you can name, and see how quickly or how long it takes you to figure out who they are, and also if you think you know who they are, how certain are you? All right, and just feel free to a few people just write in the chat. If you think you know who any of them are, or if you're not sure who some of them are.
Matt?
Yeah.
What's the name of the book that you pulled some of those quotes from? It was about the childhood.
Oh, prosopagnosia. So it's called. I'll get the exact thing and I'll share it like tomorrow or something. But I'm trying to. The title's long. I think it's Face Blindness in Children. Something about prosopagnosia strategies. But it's by Nancy Mindick. She's the editor. It's Mindik, I think. Nancy Mindick, and she's a person with prosopagnosia who wrote some of the book, and she's the editor. But yeah, you can get it on Amazon. Face Blindness in Children. I'm pretty sure that's like the main title, and then there's a colon and it says something about prosopagnosia. But yeah, it's really, again, it's like it's so geared toward kids, and it rang so true to my observations of students and my what my students have told me. And it's almost like it seems very in line with what I already knew from the CVI range, but it just gave all these adults perspectives on what it felt like, which was really cool. Okay. So anyone writing in the chat who these people are?
Yes. So we have Michael Jordan, Prince Harry, Sandra Bullock, Bill Clinton, Michelle Kwan, Justin Timberlake.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So I think between all of you got all of them between several different responses. But I'm wondering, usually there's a lot of people who only get one or two or three, or they can't get one, or there's some people that are uncertain. It's interesting because our visual face recognition area in our temporal lobe is finely tuned to recognize right side up human faces. It has a little more difficulty with upside down human faces. So even when there's a really, really famous face that you might know really well, it can be a little deceiving sometimes if it's upside down. Like when I looked at this, I got Sandra Bullock right away and I got Bill Clinton right away, but that was it. I really struggled with the other ones until I turned it over. Whoops. I turned it over, and then it was like automatic. I instantly recognized all of them. And so it was just interesting that, like, I wonder if looking at an upside down face, if there were any faces on here that were sort of vague to you, you weren't quite sure who it was, but you thought you might know. I wonder if it ever feels like that for some people with CVI when they're like looking at a familiar person's face, maybe even a family member who's not speaking, so they can't quite tell who it is. If it's like that weird feeling of, I think I know who this is, but I'm not quite sure, And so, a child with CVI may know us by our hairstyle, our color, our glasses, our height, the way you walk, the context. Nye D'Amato from the CVI perspective writes really interestingly about how they've basically come to, because Nye is like an expert in languages and speaks like, I think 8 languages fluently, and is a trained linguist. And Nye has sort of learned each person's speech pattern and as their sort of signature and the way they talk, things that I wouldn't ever notice about somebody, but that's what they've tuned into as far as how to recognize people. So I think that a lot of our students might have like a lot of these, a lot of other ways, like the way we walk, the context, our voices, and things like that, the colored glasses that we wear. I don't know if any of you have ever had a student or a son or daughter who has gotten upset when a loved one in their life has cut their hair or dyed their hair, because all of a sudden maybe the characteristic that child was using to recognize you has changed big time. I've had 2 students where I've gotten a call from the family saying, what's going on here? And we've talked about it and figured out that it was that the child had this big emotional kind of meltdown or breakdown or reaction when their mother cut their hair, and in one case cut their hair and dyed their hair. And it seemed like the child may be upset because they didn't recognize them, or because the mother was talking and it was mom's voice, but it was a stranger's face. Something that I assess with a lot of my students, and even students well into phase 3, most of my students well into phase 3 have trouble with this still. I'll show them pictures of like happy faces that are smiling, they'll say happy, sad faces that are frowning, they'll say sad. But when I get to angry faces of people baring their teeth, almost always my students, even in phase 3, say happy. And when I ask why, they say some variation of, I can see their teeth, or because they're smiling, their teeth are showing. So just interesting. One time I covered up, I showed my student, after going through this whole set of images I have, this test facial recognition of emotions, after going through, and my student aced all of them except for these teeth-bearing ones, I went through the images again and scrambled them up, and I covered the faces, and I just had the student look at the eyes, and they couldn't get any of them. So it just gave me a clue that maybe this student was not relying at all on a person's eyes when trying to judge their emotions, but just their facial feature, just their mouth, smile or frown, teeth showing, teeth not showing. So it just gave me a lot of insight. And because of the first student who did that, I knew to try this with some other students, and most of my other students in phase 3 also struggled with this. So it just gave me a way to show their families and teams that, like, this is some pretty obvious emotional information that they might be missing on a regular basis when it comes to faces. All right, so we talked about, we're going to shift now into talking about difficulty with complexity of array or simultanagnosia, difficulty seeing a lot of things at once, right? And we think of that, even though, again, both streams are involved in that, it tends to be more of a sign of dorsal stream dysfunction when a person can recognize an isolated thing, but not when it's in a clutter, in a pile with other things. That ability to manage visual attention and be consciously aware of more than a few visual things at once tends to break down when there's a dorsal stream issue. And then also things like visual motor, visually guided reach, and things like that are related to that dorsal stream. This is a simulation that if we were in person, I'd be doing, but I want to share it with you because it's been really powerful for any in-person simulation that I've done, any school team that I've used it with. And I always want to give the caveat first that the intention of this is in no way to simulate what the world might look like for our child. But I'll explain that because our student has CVI, they have difficulty using their vision to guide their reach and difficulty using their vision to figure out where they're stepping. Okay, so but it's because of a brain issue. But these goggles play tricks on our eyes to make us at least experience what it would be like to not have a match between what our eyes are seeing and where our hands and our feet are moving. So what these prism goggles do is they flip the world 180 degrees. You can flip it up and down, or you can flip it right and left, depending on which way you turn the prisms. And so basically you put these prism goggles on somebody and you try having them do like a simple connect the dot, like kindergarten or preschool thing, and they can't do it. They're moving all in the wrong direction. They think they're moving left, but their pen is going right. And again, I say this is not to simulate that our child somehow sees the world backwards. It's to simulate, it's to stop taking for granted that it's maybe not so easy to use our vision to guide our motor actions, right, for our student. And if we experience a situation where we can't take that for granted anymore, then we might be able to better empathize with them through what they're going through, even though it's for different reasons. And so anyway, the website where you can get these goggles is below. It's grandillusions.com. I think they're about $80, but it's been, you've been using them for about 7 years now, and then they really make an impact. Okay, what about the need for movement? And there's another phenomenon called blind sight. Okay, so the need for movement, we know from the CVI range, from Dr. Roman Lancey's work, that a certain type of movement can very often help a child with CVI notice or alert to something or see something, right? So for a child in phase 1, early phase 2, we might be doing a lot of gently shaking and wiggling using mylar or shiny things that mimic movement in the brain to help them look at something, right? And what that is it's thought to be closely related to what the clinical literature refers to as blind sight, meaning that even if your conscious view of the world, even if you have a lot of damage to your primary visual cortex and you're functional, they would describe it in the clinical literature often as sort of functionally blind, although we might not use that term all the time in CVI. They say that even if your occipital cortex has had a lot of damage and is very impaired, there's a visual pathway that appears to be going from our midbrain, from the lateral geniculate nucleus, to the MT area, the center of movement processing in our dorsal stream, that sort of bypasses the damaged visual cortex and allows us to alert to movement. We all have that, right? So we all have that ability. If something's in our periphery, we turn to it, right? It's just that most of us without a visual impairment don't need to rely on that so much because we also have a very rich conscious view of what's going on around us in a very put together, non-complex view maybe of what's going on around us. So we don't always have to, we can alert to something before it's moving and guide our visual attention. Whereas some of our students with CVI facing so much complexity and such an overwhelming visual scene are relying more on that intact alert to movement pathway than we might usually alert to it. Or that they might need it more than we do. So there's that kind of movement. And there's for the sake of time, I'll skip this video for now, but it's called The Blind Woman Who Saw Rain. It's by NPR Productions, and it's about 3 or 4 minutes. It's on YouTube. You can get it. I recommend watching it if you haven't seen it. It really describes what one woman went through, where she was occipitally blind due to, I think it was like I forget what kind of brain injury it was, but she could still see movement, and movement was the thing that helped her start to see better again. And I saw a lot of parallels between her, what she described, and some of my students with CVI. So that's one type of movement, right? So I was, and that's the type of movement I kind of like got used to seeing in my students with CVI, which is why I got really, really confused the first time I ran into the term echinotopsia. I think the first time I saw it might have been in Gordon Dutton's Red book, but I read a lot more about it in Vision in the Brain by Lewick and Dutton. And echinotopsia really means the inability to process or see movement. And it was sort of described as a pretty common problem in children with CVI. And I'm having this cognitive dissonance here, thinking like, well, wait a minute, what about, so, thinking like well, on one hand, I'm often moving things for my students so they can see it. That's what I've really seen work. But yet, what are we talking about when we talk about difficulty processing movement? I don't get it. And so I actually, I was at a presentation that Dr. Lotfi Meribet was doing, and I asked him about this specific question. And he said, yeah, there are two different things, and it's possible to have both. It's possible to, what he described it as the tendency of kids with CVI to alert to movement is most likely that intact, I should say all of our ability to alert to movement in our periphery on sort of that basic level represents that pathway, that sort of midbrain to dorsal stream pathway that's using movement to grab our visual attention. He said, echinotopsia has to do with something different. He described it as a much higher level processing of movement, like telling the trajectory of a car that's coming toward you to see when it's safe to cross the street, that kind of thing. Seeing as you're filling a glass of liquid, seeing the level of liquid rising and judging how far it's going to rise before you're going to overflow the glass, right? So echinotopsia is more like higher level dorsal stream processing of movement, whereas in the type of movement that helps get a student's attention is more of that basic sort of earlier level of movement processing. And he said it's perfectly possible and probably common to have both of those things happening. One of them would be that you're alerting to that sort of simple movement that's shaking or wiggling or shiny, but then you still might have difficulty processing that higher level movement of a car moving or a liquid in the glass rising or a ball coming toward you as you try to hit it in a baseball game, things like that. So just interesting, let me see here, I'm just looking at time. Yeah, I think, well, let's see. We're okay. Yeah, I'm trying, out of these videos, I'm trying to decide. I think there's one I want to show more than the other. Yeah, okay, so there's a just for your reference, there's a YouTube video called yeah, I'm going to play that actually real quick because I think it explains it better than I could. And then I'll probably skip the other two. So let's see. The top here. All right. The second one.
It is possible to break the part of your brain that perceives motion. Allow me to explain. Akinetopsia gets its name from a meaning without and kinetic referring to motion. When you have akinetopsia, you are motion blind, meaning that you can still see, but you don't see things move. This is possible because the movement you see around you is an illusion created by your brain to help you to navigate and understand your world. Movement is created in your brain based on what your eyes pick up, which are small pieces of two-dimensional light patterns. It is your brain's job to stitch them together into a moving picture. This is similar to how a movie is made up of individual still frames. Movement only appears because of the changes that happen in between images. And our brain's job is much harder than it appears because the pictures are fragmented, upside down, and riddled with missing information when they reach your visual cortex at the back of your brain. When akinetopsia occurs, the brain is unable to convert the still images into moving pictures. This loss of movement perception occurs in all three dimensions: up, down, left, right, and back, forth. Instead of objects looking like they are smoothly moving from one position to another, objects are usually perceived as jumping from place to place. Quite often, objects will show up multiple times in the vision of a person with akinetopsia because the brain thinks that there are multiple objects instead of one moving object. Because of this, the person may see duplicate, unmoving images instead of moving objects. People with akinetopsia generally compensate using touch and hearing, both of which can help them to locate the exact positions of objects. The most classic akinetopsia case was published in 1983, and it tells of a woman who developed akinetopsia after brain damage to both hemispheres of her brain. Whenever she tried to pour herself a drink, she would often overfill the cup because she couldn't see the level of the liquid rising. She complained of difficulties in crossing the street because she could not tell where the cars were at any given moment. She could successfully describe the color, model, and even the license plate number of each car, but instead of moving smoothly across her vision, they seemed to just jump from place to place. In another case, a 47-year-old man taking a newly prescribed drug noticed strange things happening in his vision. He would see multiple frozen images of the same object trailing out behind anything that was moving. While he was walking his dog, instead of seeing just his one moving dog, he saw an unmoving trail of identical-looking West Highland Terriers stretching out behind his dog as it walked. When his medications were adjusted, the akinetopsia went away. Akinetopsia seems to occur because of damage or disruptions to a part of the brain's visual cortex called V5, located in the occipital lobe. Research has shown that using a technique...
So just for reference, it's called a few different things. So V5 is another name for the MT area, which I think middle temporal area. It's part of the dorsal stream, and it's the center of movement processing in the brain.
Technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, on this V5 region produces temporary motion blindness, so this area is probably responsible in medical cases as well. Unlike most kinds of brain damage, akinetopsia is temporary in most cases, and vision for motion eventually returns. It must be quite a surprise for these rare people who see the world stand still.
Yeah, so I'm going to show one more video too. So I think this is like a 30-second one. I'll just get rid of this bar. So I had one of my students this year in the winter. He's a big skier. He's an avid downhill skier, and he texted me one day and said, "Hey, I've got an issue about skiing I need to talk to you about." And so we were chatting, and he said, all through text. And he said, when I was waiting for the chairlift, I couldn't see it coming. And it hit my legs and surprised me. And usually he does fine on the chairlift, getting on and off. But I said, what do you mean you didn't see it coming? Like, and so as we talked, he explained that he was able to see it in the distance, but it didn't look like it was moving. It just looked like it was sitting still. And then all of a sudden it was hitting his legs. And so we watched the videos on echinotopsia together. We described, went through what it means and looked at the areas of the brain in our next session and stuff like that. And he doesn't usually have that issue, but it seems like every now and then it crops up for him. And so we came up with some strategies to help him with the chairlift in case that happens again. So who knows what was the issue? Maybe he was visually fatigued. Maybe there was a bigger crowd than usual. Who could say? But in that moment, it seemed to experience some echinotopsia. I have a few other students who have gotten very nervous when people approach them and get into their space, like to say hello, and will even kind of flinch or jolt when the person gets close to them. And it seems as though through conversations with some of their family members, through observations, through conversations with one of them, that it's hard to see the person approaching until the person's right in front of them. And that's another thing that people with echinotopsia describe. Gordon Dutton has coined the term looming for that, meaning that it seems like nothing's like in your visual field, and all of a sudden something's right in front of you. And I thought that a good simulation for that would be the virtual backgrounds that we have in Zoom meetings. Because sometimes things will just seem to disappear and reappear from that background. So I thought, what might it be like if the background looked empty and then all of a sudden somebody just appeared next to you? So check this out really quick. Gotta find it. Zooming. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Hi, Matt.
Oh.
Right. So imagine if let's try it one more time.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Matt.
Right. So just like that whole idea of not having anything in the background, you seem to see a plain room, and then all of a sudden an animal or a person is showing up right in front of you, could be really understandably alarming. And that seems to be directly related to this difficulty processing certain types of movement. Okay. All right, sort of like the last big characteristic, difficulty with simultaneous visual information, right? In the clinical neurology literature, it's often referred to as simultanagnosia. In the CVI range, it's difficulty with complexity of array. Not necessarily saying they're exactly the same thing, but that's how in my brain, I kind of relate the two. And so in the simulation, these were the types of the activities that I was trying to simulate. What are our thresholds as people without CVI? I don't think there's anyone with CVI on the call, but as individuals without CVI, what are our thresholds for too much visually, too much complexity, too much simultaneous visual information? And I think, Waldo, the textbook passage with no spaces between words, trying to count those dots and keep track of where you are in visual space. I think these were all exercises that tested the limits of our own dorsal stream processing, our own ability to handle a lot of information at once. Now, of course, something like, this is, again, a great example of how we're not only just using one stream at a time. If we're looking for Waldo, we're using our ventral stream to keep his salient features in mind, to be looking for the hat, the glasses, but then we're also using our dorsal stream to be consciously aware of all the visual information at once and to guide our attentional spotlight as we look for those salient features. So as we read the textbook passage, we're using our ventral stream to identify the letters and words, but we're using our dorsal stream to try to separate them out and manage our visual attention from one to the next and see the spaces and everything. Try to create spaces between words where there are none. Okay, so I like to use this simulation. I like to use our auditory channels to try to simulate what might it be like to have difficulty with too much visual information at once. I think, to me, that's hard to, outside of something like these exercises we just did, like a Where's Waldo, it's hard for me to really appreciate that, because if we don't have CVI or a visual impairment, then usually seeing lots of things at once isn't a big deal, right? It's pretty easy. But I think processing a lot of auditory information at once it can be a lot more difficult to identify what the words are. If more than one person is talking to you at the same time, at the same volume, you can hear them, but picking out the individual words gets really hard. So let's thinking of that. Let's do this quick simulation. I know why that bark keeps popping up. It's because whenever I hit escape to get out of full screen mode, escape is also the key command for that pop-up window. Okay, let's see. All right, so if we go to, here it is. So we're gonna have two quick auditory exercises right here. We're gonna pretend that we're walking into a classroom. In this first one, we're gonna be walking into a classroom, and that classroom is gonna be completely empty except for one object in the middle of the room. And we're gonna have our eyes closed or pretend our eyes are closed, and we're not gonna see the object visually. We're gonna see the object auditorily. We're gonna hear the salient features of the object listed over and over again. And we're gonna see if we can auditorily identify what that object is when it's just one object. Okay, let's try it. So we're opening that door, walking into the classroom.
Four legs, flat seat, straight back. Four legs, flat seat, straight back. Four legs, flat seat, straight back.
All right, can anybody get what object that was? You just put it in the chat or just call it out if you want.
Would it be a chair?
Yeah, exactly, a chair, right? So that was pretty easy probably when it's just one object, right? But now let's leave that room. Let's walk into the classroom next door that has 7 objects in it, okay? And the rest of the room is empty, but there's 7 objects in the middle of the room. And we're gonna hear the salient features of all those objects listed at once and see how many objects your auditory system can pick out and identify.
Two curved handles, faucet, face curbs, faucet, face, faucet, face, two curved faucet, base, faucet.
Okay. Feel free to just kind of put in the chat, or just speak out if you can pick out some objects from there.
Could it be a faucet, a laptop, a chair?
There was a chair. Yep, there was a chair. The 4 legs, flat seat, straight back was still there. There was a faucet. I don't think there was a laptop.
Because preconceived notion about the previous one that was a chair, all I heard 4 legs.
Yeah, so it's like visual novelty, right? Versus familiarity. Like, yeah, everything else, that's such a great point. Everything else was unfamiliar, but you expected to kind of hear the 4 legs. Very interesting. Yeah, so it's like a jumble though, right? And I wonder if that's a way to just sort of imagine, you know, our auditory thresholds are so easily overwhelmed. What if our visual thresholds were that easily overwhelmed with just a few objects? What might that feel like? You know, this is one way I try to imagine that. Okay. Okay, so simultanagnosia. Let's see. I'm gonna check the time real quick. 4:37. Yeah, what the heck. All right, so I'm trying to figure out which video is. I'm gonna show the first one. All right, so simultanagnosia again is it's sort of like, I think it's very related to difficulty with complexity of array. The reason why I like to also research simultanagnosia is because, you know, if you look up research on children with CVI, there's not a whole lot yet, like say on the university library that you can find. There's a growing amount, which is nice. But if I look up simultanagnosia and literacy, simultanagnosia and math, simultanagnosia and, you know, visual scenes, there's tons of research articles that come up. So, you know, without saying it's exactly the same thing, and each person's brain is different, I like to use what I hear about from simultanagnosia to try certain assessments and certain things with my students to see if they might be experiencing some similar things. So simultanagnosia is basically when you have a damaged or underconnected dorsal stream. You know, specifically your posterior parietal cortex. Especially if it's bilateral damage, then typically people with that have what's called pure simultanagnosia, where you can really only see one or two things at a time. In this video is an example of an older man in a university laboratory who is being evaluated for simultanagnosia because of some brain damage that he had to those parietal lobes in his brain, and he can only see one thing at a time now. Okay, so here he is.
Grab it with that hand.
Now, this isn't actually the main part, but watch as he reaches here. Difficulty with visually guided reach is another cluster, is part of the cluster of symptoms that you see in people with simultanagnosia.
Can you see it?
I can see it, but I can't tell.
I can see it, but I can't reach
You
to
can do
it.
better with your left hand. And take a crack at it up here, if I hold it up closer. All right, how about now that you touched it with that hand, can you reach with the other hand and grab it? With your right hand?
With my right hand?
Uh-huh.
No, I can't.
If I wiggle it, does moving it help you at all?
Nah, well,
Yeah, it does a little bit. So motion sort of pulls you toward it, like.
You know, this is the main part where he only sees one at a time.
What do you see here?
a comb,
Mm-hmm. What do you see now?
comb,
What do you see now?
spoon,
Do you see the comb?
no,
Do you see the comb?
yeah,
Do you see the spoon?
mm-hmm.
What do you see now?
I see the spoon,
What do you see now?
comb,
Do you see a spoon at all?
yeah,
Okay. Can you see what? Just tell me what you see.
I see what looks like a blackboard with some writing on it.
Mm-hmm. And there is a blackboard with some writing right behind us. So when you lost track of what was there, you picked up whatever was right in front of you, I guess. And you can see the writing, so it's your acuity is okay. You can see the writing.
So I love that statement. You can see the writing, so your acuity is okay. It's not your acuity, right? We know it's not an acuity issue. It's a brain-based visual processing issue. And so many parallels to my students. I mean, the difficulty with visually guided reach, the evaluators wiggling it to add movement to it to help the man see and reach for it, the difficulty handling multiple pieces of information at a time, and I think the fact that he has trouble with figure ground, that rings true for my experience with some of my students too, where he's trying to look for something that's close up, but for a moment, he's only seeing the thing that's way off in the distance, and he's having trouble telling which one is right in front of him. And I'm not going to show the other video just for time today, but CVI Scotland, if you type in CVI Scotland simultanagnosia video on Google, it should come up. And it's just basically their attempt at it's a pretty cool simulation of how some people with simultanagnosia have described the world. I'm just going to this thing. Okay. And so also from CVI Scotland, they simulate it using pictures too. They say, so let's say you're looking at this image of people with the balloons here. Some people with simultanagnosia report only being consciously aware of small portions of a visual scene at once. And it's different than tunnel vision, of course, because it's not as if, it's not like it's a retina problem or, or a problem with another part of the eye that's making you only see a certain part of the visual field or, or the optic nerve or something. It's a problem with the dorsal stream's ability to attend to more than a couple pieces of information at once. And what they report is that different parts of the visual scene will stand out one at a time. And then as one stands out, the other will disappear. And they can never really figure out what the whole scene is or where they are in that visual scene. And I don't know, that it's probably, my guess is that difficulty with complexity of array doesn't look like this for all students with CVI, but that something like this might be very closely related to some of our students' experiences. Okay, so we just encountered the limits of dorsal stream, our own dorsal stream ability, right? Like with Where's Waldo and the dots that we had to count and all that stuff. What might be the same for our kids with CVI? What might reach their threshold, right? Well, for one of my students, it was having this background over on the left here when he was trying to look at one object at a time and identify it. He really couldn't because of all the stuff in the background. He had trouble separating all that complexity in the background from what we were showing him in the foreground, right? A communication device like the one in the middle, that might be too big of an array, and it might exceed the complexity threshold for some students from a dorsal stream standpoint. And again, I should say ventral stream too, because it's as you're searching for something, you're using both. And then for others, it might be like in phase 3, it might be a complex worksheet. This was one of my students' Latin worksheets, and she just couldn't, handle the visual complexity, and it was very well modified in partnership with her and her materials modification specialist. But this is how it looked before it was modified. All right, this was for some kids, like one of my students in phase 2, this amount of visual stuff on the table right here exceeded his limits for complexity of array, and he was unable to find his cup or his spoon, even with the yellow labels, until we blocked out everything in the background. Okay. Simultanagnosia can make it really difficult for many of our students, I think, to process visual scenes. Right. So the same student, the same student who had that Latin worksheet there, when I was showing her this picture of a hurricane damage where a tree had fallen on the car, I just showed her the picture in an assessment, and I said, "What do you see here?" And she said, "Well, I see a big tree. Looks like a big tree tipped over." Oh, no. She said, "It's a tree tipped over." And then I waited a little bit for her to say more. And I said, "Can you tell me more about this picture?" She said, "Well, it might be a big tree." And I waited, and that was it. So what I did, let me see if I put it here. I didn't put it there, but I'm going to explain it, I think, tomorrow in some of the slides. When I put a 4-quadrant grid over it, and helped her explore this visual scene sequentially, she was able to pick up everything in it, and was able to tell me what was going on in the picture. And I'll show you examples of that tomorrow. Okay. So, all right, so distance visual information, right? Christine Roman Lancy really, when she taught this to me, it was a real eye-opener on one of the reasons why so many of my students were having distance viewing difficulties, even if their acuity was pretty decent. And what she pointed out was that the further away you get from something in most environments, the more complexity is in your visual field that you have to deal with and try to sort out. So she taught me the whole concept of part of the CVI range assessment for distance is having your kid do a scavenger hunt for some of their favorite items, but putting those items out of context in an environment where there's other visual information and see how close they need to get to it before the complexity is reduced enough where they can find it. And so for one of my students in phase 2, I hid her singamajig in the school library. This red thing here, it was like one of her favorite things that she could find anywhere in her individual classroom. She could find it anywhere. But when I put it in the school library, a little bit out of context, she walked in and she looked for it and couldn't find it. Her friend who was passing by, this boy named Leo with autism, he found it from 12 feet away, walked over to it before my student came into the room, picked it up and started looking at it. And I said, "Oh, put that back. Our friend is coming to try to find it." And so he put it back. And it wasn't even his toy, but he noticed it from 12 feet away with just a quick glance over in that direction. When my student came in, she didn't notice it until she was about 2 feet away. Look how much complexity is in this picture from 12 feet away versus the point of view from a couple feet away. Much less complexity. And that told me that this is about her threshold for complexity. Any further away than that, any more of an increase in complexity, and she's not going to usually find it. Another reason that I've read, this was more from Vision in the Brain, that students with CVI may sometimes have that difficulty with distance vision, despite, even if they have good acuity, is because of this phenomenon of zooming in and zooming out with your visual attention. When we're looking at something close up, our visual attentional kind of dorsal stream spotlight is zoomed way in, so that we're only looking right in front of us, and we have sort of a really small visual field. But when we're trying to focus on things way out in the distance or find something way out in the distance, our window of visual attention has to zoom way out to capture a much wider area of visual attention, in that can be difficult for some people with CVI. Okay. And of course, novelty. Novelty is, I think, to me, really a function of difficulty with visual complexity, right? What's the reason a child some kids with CVI have difficulty in novel environments, more so than familiar ones? Well, my thought would be that if the child had no difficulty with complexity of array, that would mean that they would be able to look at a busy environment like a grocery store or a new classroom. And if they had no difficulty with complexity of array and they could handle all of that visual information at once, then they would be able to sort out what desks were where the teacher's desk was, where the smartboard was, where the beanbag chair was. They'd be able to sort it all out and handle it all at once, and it might not be that overwhelming. So if that was the case, if they had no difficulty with complexity of array or difficulty with complexity of object, right? If they were able to identify everything they saw in that room right away, then there would be no need to worry about novelty, I don't think. You could still argue that there would be because of fields and things like that, but I think that one of the main barriers is you walk into a new room and it looks like just this mess of unintelligible information. If you didn't have that issue, I think that exploring that new environment wouldn't be as big a deal, so novelty wouldn't be as much of an issue. And I think it's similar with, say, like drawings in a picture book. If you had no issues with visual recognition, and you could tell that a dog is a dog because of its salient features, regardless of what form it's drawn in or represented in, then it wouldn't matter if you were looking at a novel picture book. You could see any picture of a dog and tell that it's a dog. But because of the difficulty with complexity of object, you might not be able to tell it's a dog, and therefore, if it's a novel picture book, you might not know what the picture means, right? So I think novelty really has its roots in difficulty with visual complexity, and that's not really my idea. That's something that Christine Roman taught me, and helped me see how the characteristics are much more intertwined than I thought when I first went to that boot camp in 2013. That was really my big sort of first huge learning curve with CVI. Okay, so nearing toward the end here. This is good timing because it's just about the end. We got about 10 minutes left. And this is where I want to make the case for, because the whole title of this 3-day workshop is designing an appropriate, accessible school day for kids with CVI. And I think unfortunately, I've found that too often I have to justify to teams why it's important and why it's our obligation to redesign their school experience to fit their visual abilities. So I like to start with a quote from Nicola McDowell, who is a person with CVI, who writes a blog on CVI Scotland. And in this blog, she's remembering what it was like in high school when she had CVI. And she's talking about what she would do when she went home. And she says, she's talking about going home and retreating to her bedroom after a busy day at school. And she says, "My bedroom had become a safe place, a place where I wasn't terrorized by my visual issues because I was in complete control of the environment. I had made sure that it was as uncluttered as possible and knew where everything was. It also never changed. Without really understanding why, I had simply created an environment for myself where I was able to relax and recharge my visual brain and overall energy levels without fighting against the constant clutter, noise, and unpredictability of the outside world." So Nicola McDowell was able to create a safe space for her, a respite from the visual and sensory complexity that she faced during the school day. Well, after I read this for the first time, I thought, how many of my students have the same amount of agency and control over their environment as she did as a teenager? And then I was thinking about it, and I thought, unfortunately, not that many of them, unless we give them that opportunity and really sort of support them in having that opportunity. And, who's going to redesign their world if they don't do it themselves? I think the answer is us, the people who understand their visual needs, the people who are closest to them in their life and in their education. So this sort of sometimes clash. This view of needing to redesign very systematically the elements of the school day for a child with CVI sometimes clashes with even well-meaning teachers' outlook on in philosophy toward accessibility. So one time I was chatting with a teacher who had, I think, 3 of my students at the time in the same classroom. And she was awesome. She did a lot of the interventions that I suggested. She was really motivated, really creative teacher, cared a lot about the students. But something she said struck me one day. It made me realize I needed to fine tune my argument for why we need to make the entire school day accessible for kids with CVI. She said to me, I don't go overboard with interventions because it's not like someone is going to redesign the world for them when they graduate, right? So why should we design a visually accessible school day if they might get out into the quote unquote real world and they're back into the complexity again? So I have sort of a few part argument for why that doesn't matter, why it's still our job and the students still deserve an accessible school day. So first of all, it's the law, right? IDEA requires an appropriate education. If our students can't access the curriculum, they won't learn it and they're not getting an appropriate education, right? And also, all the teachers that I've met expect appropriate behavior from their students. All the teams expect appropriate behavior. And when the student's not showing what we consider appropriate behavior, there's often teams of behaviorists and, social workers and the whole team's getting together trying to figure out how to give the student rewards or consequences and how to help them change their behavior. But if we're not designing appropriate activities for them in the first place, I don't think there's any way we can expect them to demonstrate what we consider appropriate behavior or to show the behavior that we're hoping for. And I like to use this analogy of swimming lessons too. Okay, so let's think about this. No one is going to redesign the world for them when they're older, so therefore, why bother with interventions now? Well, let's think of a swimming lessons analogy to kind of counter this thought. When we teach a child to swim, we don't say, let's abandon the flotation devices and using the shallow end because, they might not always be available in the real world. Of course we don't do that. We use the flotation devices. We use the shallow end because it's what the child needs right now. These accommodations provide the child with a point of entry into the water so that he can learn how to swim more and more independently. For children with CVI, the accommodations we put in place are what our students need right now. If we are going to expect our students to learn how to feel comfortable and competent in increasingly unsupported situations, we have to give them a point of entry into that world. The supports that we give them in school are their point of entry into that world. And we already we already do this for ourselves. We already design the world for ourselves to fall within our visual abilities. One time I was sitting at my a desk in a library writing a report on the need for a student to have a less complex work environment. And then the irony of the situation dawned on me that I was sitting in an incredibly non-complex work environment doing my work. There was virtually no noise. There was, because of the study corral, there was no visual complexity in my visual field, and there was no movement of people walking past me because the corral blocked it off. This is the environment that adults design for ourselves to get work done in. This, I'm not kidding either, this is the view from the desk of the student whose report I was writing. And that you'll recognize this video, or this is a frozen shot from the video that was in that simulation. This is the view from my student's desk in her classroom. So how can we say that it's unreasonable to expect us to redesign the world and create a less complex environment for our students now because they won't always have access to that in the real world? We already do that for ourselves in the quote unquote real world. How can we do this for ourselves and then give this to a child with CVI and expect them to get any work done? I also used a decibel meter in the library. It was 44 peak decibels, and let's see if in it. Okay. And it said it estimated that I was in a quiet library. When I was in her classroom the next week, I took out my decibel meter on my phone, and it said the peak was 69 decibels, and it estimated that I was sitting in traffic, right? Cars honking, engine noises, all that stuff. All right, right near the end here. I know we got a couple minutes left. It's perfect timing. We'll get to the 2D image assessments and visual recognition tomorrow. So why redesign? Well, we do this for the physical world, or we're supposed to, right? To make the physical world more accessible. A lot of painstaking engineering and design goes into creating a simple set of stairs, like at a public library or a city hall building, right? Painstaking design goes into how high to make each step, how deep to make each step, how many steps to make, so that the person with average physical abilities can comfortably walk up those steps without giving much effort or thought to how to get up the steps, right? But all that painstaking design still doesn't help a person in a wheelchair get to that same destination. So what do? We redesign, right? Because if we just had that staircase, no matter how thoughtfully we thought we designed it for everybody else, that person in the wheelchair is not going to feel welcome. Similarly, if this classroom on the right is what we're giving to a student with CVI and expecting them to work in, then no amount of welcome signs on the door are gonna make up for that and make the child feel welcome and feel like it's their classroom where they have a level playing field to succeed in. All right, Gordon Dutton says, it is only by careful assessment and continued observation of the visual behavior of such children that we can gain a deeper understanding of how they see. This knowledge can in turn be used to structure communication, information, and the environment, ensuring that each element is designed to fall within the perceptual limitations of each child. Okay, we got like 1 minute left. So this is Haben Girma talking with Barack Obama. Haben Girma is the first deaf-blind person to graduate Harvard Law School, and she's a disabilities advocate attorney. I got to see her speak at NEAER a few years ago, and it was phenomenal. And here are a few things she said that I thought really helped make this argument for our students. Disability isn't a barrier in and of itself, right? The barriers come from the choices that communities make. These barriers are a design challenge, an opportunity to innovate and come up with new solutions. Strive to make everything accessible, and people with disabilities will surprise you, right? And so I think it's an exciting thing. It's not like a burden or a task that we have to do. It can maybe seem overwhelming, and I hope that something as systematic as the What's the Complexity framework will help with that a little bit. You know, the whole task of designing a whole school day for a kid with CVI. I thought the task was overwhelming without a system, which is why I kind of like, developed that one for myself. But we have the opportunity. It's an exciting opportunity. It's a design challenge, like Haben Girma says. We have an opportunity to design an accessible school day for each kid with CVI. So I'm hoping that tomorrow and the next day, what I have to share will help everybody feel just even a little bit more equipped and a little bit more confident, or having some new ideas in that effort to design an accessible school day. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. We'll start off with image recognition and 2D interpretation, salient features, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's a lot of wonderful information. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.
So for those who need the ACVREP code, the closing code is SHINE. The closing code is SHINE, and I also put it in the chat box. And I look forward to also seeing your names tomorrow, 2 o'clock Eastern time. We'll be back here with Mr. Matt Tijan.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night and see you tomorrow.
Thanks again, Matt.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.